Order, order. Steve Double to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Austin. I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition 216593 relating to the status of the Windrush generation children. It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Austin, and it's also a great honour to be able to open this debate on this very important and pressing issue. Just to make clear, I am opening the debate as a member of the Petitions Committee that has agreed to schedule this debate for today. I want to start by thanking the petitioner, Mr Patrick Vernon, who I had the pleasure of meeting just before this debate, who initiated this petition, but also the more than 178,000 people who have signed it in just a very short few days. The e-petition calls for amnesty for anyone who was a minor that arrived in Britain between 1948 and 1971. The text of the petition goes into further detail and also includes a link to a story published by The Guardian on the 30th of March about Waldo Romeo, a man who moved from Antigua to the UK nearly 60 years ago when he was a child, who has lived and worked in this country ever since. Mr Romeo has received a letter from the Home Office stating that he was liable to detention as he was classified as a person without leave. After experiencing difficulty in producing documentation to prove his identity and right to remain in the UK, he was asked to report to the Home Office every fortnight and was offered help and support to return home voluntarily, according to The Guardian. He is understandably anxious that the Home Office will pay him a visit on his doorstep and forcibly detain him. I will happily give way.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. At the time of Chogham, the BBC interviewed a Caribbean Prime Minister who stated that this was, in his words, more cock-up than conspiracy. Does that not influence what our decision is, which is to put the situation right, that it's an administrative mistake that needs to be put right as quickly as possible?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I believe he's right, that this is not a conspiracy, that this is a mistake. This is well-meaning policy that has been wrongly applied to people to whom it should never have been applied to. And I think that's a point that I will go on to develop, and I'm sure many other honourable and right honourable members...
Will you give way?
I'll gladly give way, yes.
I am staggered by what he's just said. A well-meaning policy. How can the creation of a hostile environment and putting a hostile environment into a policy be well-meaning? I think it is time for apology and not thin, sanctimonious explanation.
Steve Double.
I thank the honourable member for that intervention. I think if she waits to hear what I'm going to go on to say, it will become clear. But I think I would hope that we could keep the tone of this debate constructive and positive, that we can put right what has gone wrong here for the benefit of those who have been wrongly affected by it. And those who want to score political points from it may feel free to do so, but I'm not going to seek to do that. I'm going to seek to address the concerns of the people who have signed this petition. I'll gladly give way, yes.
I'm very grateful for the honourable gentleman giving way. I'm grateful for the tone, the calm tone that he is striking in initiating this debate today. Would he agree with me that it's important to remember, given the previous intervention, that it was a Labour government that first coined the term hostile environment?
Yes, absolutely.
I think my honourable member makes a very good point. I will now press on. Mr Romeo's story was one of many stories. Just made a little bit of progress, and I will... OK, I'll give way to my honourable friend.
From a secondary position, said that my honourable friend was wrong in how he had intervened. The honourable lady keeps saying an awful lot of stuff from a secondary position. Would my honourable friend accept, because the rewriting of history on such a sensitive issue is, I think, unhelpful to both sides of this debate and in moving this thing forward, that for perfectly legitimate reasons at the time, the right honourable gentleman, the member for Birmingham Hodge Hill, referred to not only having a hostile environment, but where he sought to flush out illegal migration. Illegal is the key word.
I'm very grateful to my friend for that intervention, and I think he makes a very pertinent point, that what we've got to be very clear about here is differentiating between illegal immigration and people who clearly have a right to remain in this country but are, for all sorts of reasons, having trouble proving that right. And that is the difference here. And I think governments over many years of all different parties have taken various steps to take robust, and rightly so, action against illegal immigration. But when we seek to conflate those two issues with the current situation, I believe we do a disservice to those of the Windrush generation who rightly have a legal right to stay. I'm going to make some more progress. I will take interventions again in a little while, but I think I need to make some more progress, Mr. Austin. Mr. Romeo's story was one of the many stories that drew widespread public concern about the status of the Windrush generation and their children, who have spent most, if not the entirety of their lives in this country. Other awful examples of treatments faced by members of the Windrush generation have come to light in recent weeks, which has rightly led to concern from many people, as evidenced by the number of people who signed this petition in just a few days. And while this situation is not only devastating for all those affected by it and should never have happened, it does provide a very timely reminder to all of us to learn from a very significant period of time for our nation. Now, I won't give way just now, I'll make a bit more progress. It is almost precisely 50 years since the ship Empire Windrush docked at the port of Tilbury on the 22nd of June 1948. It brought with it the hopes and dreams of more than 500 passengers from the British West Indies who had just been given citizenship of the United Kingdom and colonies under the 1948 British Nationality Act. Advertisements had appeared in local newspapers in Jamaica offering cheap transport for anyone who wanted to make a living in the UK. Amongst this group of British subjects, nearly half were former servicemen who wanted to return to the nation they were enlisted to fight for during the war, while others were simply attracted to the better opportunities offered by what they affectionately and proudly called the mother country. The arrival of the Windrush passengers marked the beginning of a multicultural modern Britain. In the following decades, thousands from the Caribbean and indeed other Commonwealth countries followed in their footsteps. Together they became known as the Windrush generation. Most intended to stay for a few years, save some money and return to the West Indies. However, as time passed, the majority decided to remain and make this country their home. They married, raised families and built their lives here. I will now give way.
Honourable gentleman for giving way. And the issue about who did what and who introduced what. Simply put, if we have a proper inquiry, we can establish what exactly happened in the Home Office and who gave certain instructions, because targets were part of it, a hostile environment was part of it, to clear it up so that we don't have a tweedledum. Let's have a proper inquiry and find out what actually happened. Furthermore, can I say to the Honourable Gentleman, this doesn't stop at the West Indies. There's other groups here I suspect will be affected by the same methods that the Home Office used, so we should have an inquiry and let's sort this out.
Steve Double.
I thank the Honourable Member for that intervention, and what I would say to him is an inquiry may or may not be appropriate, but my focus is in getting things right for the people that have been affected by this current situation. I am sure there will be lessons to be learned for the future for the Home Office and for the government, and I am absolutely sure that those lessons will be learnt. But I think our focus right now needs to be on righting a wrong that has happened and making sure that the people who have been affected by it get all of the help and support that they need at this time. I'll make a bit more progress and I'll take another intervention. Life for the Windrush generation was often tough, but this was the generation that worked hard to overcome the many social, economic and cultural changes of post-war Britain, of post-war Britain. Let me be very clear. The Windrush generation are people who responded to our invitation to come to this country as British subjects, to help us rebuild our country in the years after the war. They are not economic migrants or asylum seekers. This was the generation that helped us build the NHS. These were the people who contributed to Britain's re-emergence as one of the most prosperous post-war nations in Europe. Indeed, they also played a role in shaping modern Britain by making us one of the most vibrant and multicultural nations in the world. It is therefore totally shocking to hear about the treatment of some of the Windrush generation. It is appalling that some have been refused access to NH services, lost their jobs, or even been threatened with deportation. Here, I would like to draw the attention to the language of the petition that we are debating today. The petition specifically asks for amnesty for the Windrush generation children. Amnesty is granted to someone who has been found to be guilty of breaking the law. In the context of this issue before us today, it would imply illegal immigrants. Although I totally recognise the intention of the petition, I want to make a very important point. These people do not require amnesty. They already have the right to remain here, and I'll happily give way.
I thank him for giving way. He's right that we've got to learn the lessons of what has happened. However, I say this to him, my constituent Paulette Wilson was detained in October last year. What she wants to know and what her family want to know and what I want to know as her MP is why did it take her detention? She's been here for 50 years, worked in the UK, worked in Parliament serving MPs. Why did it take her detention and the appalling treatment of others for this scandal to come to light?
Steve Double.
I thank the Honourable Member for the intervention. I think she makes a very good point. I will go on to address that very specifically, but to just say at this point that I think on this occasion the Home Office have been too slow to respond. There were warning signs about this, and more should have been done sooner. And I don't think actually anyone is particularly arguing otherwise than that. That mistakes have been made here that have been deeply damaging to some people's lives. It shouldn't have happened. We've got to put it right and make sure it never happens again. I will give way.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, but this comes to the core, not just of the policy, but of the practice. And what is wrong with the Home Office in that, when it's quite clear these things are going wrong, why is there no overriding corrective mechanism? Why do senior officials not, when they're approached by members of Parliament, look at this again in the light of that? Why do ministers not intervene in order to resolve this? Why has it taken so long when it was clear, it's crystal clear in the press and in correspondence that there was something going seriously wrong? There is a deep structural problem in the Home Office Immigration Department that needs to be addressed.
The Honourable Member for that question, and I would just respectfully say to him, I suspect that's more a question for the Minister than me. I think that's above my pay grade to answer for the government on the issues that he's referring to. I recognise those issues, but I suspect maybe the Minister will respond to that, or he may want to raise that point later. We have a duty to ensure that the Windrush generation and their children know that they are welcome here and that they belong here. We do not want any Commonwealth citizens who came to this country between 1948 or 1971, who have subsequently made their life in the UK as law-abiding citizens, to feel unwelcome or be in any doubt about their future in this country. I think it should be stated that the response from the Home Office to this situation has been too slow. Not only should this situation never have occurred, once it was known about, the government should have spotted what was happening and reacted much quicker. However, although late, I do commend the actions that the government are now taking to help the Windrush generation and their children obtain their right to remain here. The clear apologies from the Prime Minister and other members of the government have been welcome. But we need more than words. We need action to correct what has gone wrong. The Home Secretary first announced on Monday the 16th of April that she was establishing a new and dedicated team to help the Windrush generation evidence their right to be here and to access the public services they need. This team aims to resolve cases within 2 weeks of evidence being produced. She has also stated that the Home Office does not intend to ask the group to pay for their documentation. Last Monday, the Home Secretary expanded on her initial statement by committing to waive citizen fees for the Windrush generation, members who are applying for citizenship, waive the language and life in the UK tests for them, and waiving the administrative costs of Windrush retirees currently residing in their country of origin to return to the UK. She has also announced other measures which are of particular interest to the petition's signatories. Firstly, the petition called for Windrush minors to be given the right to remain in the UK. Indeed, most Windrush generation children in the UK are already British citizens. However, should they have to apply for naturalisation, the government will be waiving the fees associated. Secondly, the petition states the government should also provide compensation for loss and hurt. The government has said that a new compensation scheme will be set up for those who have suffered loss as a result of this issue. This is clearly the right thing to do. But I would also ask the Minister whether the government has considered providing support and counselling for those who have suffered distress and stress and upheaval that is affecting their day-to-day lives as part of this compensation package. This should not just be about recompensing them for costs that they have incurred, but also the support that they need to get over and move on from this traumatic experience. I'll happily give way.
I'm very grateful for the Honourable General giving way. I think he's laying out in very useful terms a series of actions that this government is taking. Would he feel like me that the leadership provided by the new Home Secretary this morning will prove decisive? I've just come from the Chamber where he said that he will do whatever it takes to deal with this in a timely and decisive fashion. Does he share that confidence that I have in the new Home Secretary?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I would say indeed I do. I mean, I would add that I think the previous Home Secretary was also completely committed and was taking action to address this issue. But I also have tremendous faith in the newly appointed Home Secretary that he will get to the heart of this issue and make sure it's put right and that the lessons that need to be learnt are learnt. I'll come on to that point now. Going forward, officials working at all levels of the Home Office must learn important lessons from the failures that have beleaguered the Windrush generation and their children. These mistakes should never have happened, and there have been warning signs from members coming forward in recent weeks to say that they were receiving casework relating to this issue. I will make a bit more progress now and then allow an intervention. Ministers and Home Office officials must now focus on establishing the status of the Windrush generation and their descendants with all possible speed and ensure that the administrative issues of missing documentation for our citizens are not a barrier. Windrush cases must be prioritised. The Home Office must also take a far more proactive approach. It cannot wait until a particular case has gone into the public domain before deciding to take action to resolve the case. The Windrush generation are British, they belong here, and the task is now to provide them with the legal status that reflects this. I applaud the new team's intent to resolve cases within 2 weeks after the evidence has been produced. And it is vital that commitments like this are kept to in order to restore the public trust in the Home Office. In the past week, since I agreed to lead this debate, I've been engaging with lawyers and volunteers who are assisting members of the Windrush generation to secure their legal status, as well as church and community leaders who represent this group. Many of these people are descendants of the Windrush generation or have personal connection with them. They have expressed their concerns about the capacity and effectiveness of the dedicated helpline that was set up to deal with the inquiries. They have also asked if there will be a deadline date beyond which the Home Office might not be able to help further with those seeking help. So can I ask the Minister to clarify what her department will be doing to ensure that the helpline is able to effectively give help to everyone seeking advice, and if there is a deadline or a cut-off point after which people might not be able to get the help from this new helpline that they seek. I am glad that the former Home Secretary acknowledged that the burden of proof to produce evidence of their legal right has been too much for some, and suggested that the department will be dealing with these individuals in a more personal manner. These are people who came as British subjects and were not subject to any condition or restriction when they entered the UK. As we now know, many have found the task of producing evidence of their continuous residency here difficult. We need to prevent the Windrush generation and their children from facing further uncertainty over their status in the future and allow them to be treated with dignity and the respect that they deserve. On the 22nd of June this year, we will mark the 70th anniversary of the arrival of HMS Windrush. This is a great opportunity for the British public to be informed about the positive legacy that this generation of pioneers and help younger generations to appreciate the sacrifices that they have made for this country. I would ask the Minister if there are any plans for the government to commemorate this monumental occasion and celebrate the contributions that the Windrush generation have made to British society. With Brexit fast approaching us, the government must get things right for EU citizens. The Home Office must work now to ensure, just 1 minute, ensure that the EU citizens who decide to stay here legally after Brexit know that they are welcome and that they will not face similar treatment. I will happily give way.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, but a couple of times he's referred to these issues as though they've only blown up in the last few weeks. Now, it may have been there's been a massive press coverage in the last few weeks, but these issues have been going on for months and indeed years, and there has been an almost complete failure to recognise that and to put the corrective mechanisms in. That's precisely why a full restructuring of the Immigration Directorate in the Home Office is required.
Thank the honourable member for that intervention. I think I did say that there have been warning signs and cases that should have highlighted this for some time now. I mean, I don't know whether it's years or months. I mean, I've been aware of it for months, certainly. If he says it's years, I'm not going to argue with him. But I think whatever the period of time is, that action should have, I think we're all agreed, action should have been taken sooner to address this issue before it got to the state that it did in recent weeks. I think on that we absolutely can agree. Back to EU citizens, I commend the Home Office for preparing for a new form of ID that will be simple and straightforward in order that the 3.7 million EU citizens will have clear and secure documentation of their legal status. I believe this will be, just 1 moment, this will be vital to avoid similar mistakes in the future, and I hope that the Home Office will be able to publish further details about this identification scheme in the very near future, and I'll happily give way.
I thank the member for giving way, and is he aware that there is a chance that iPhones will not be able to be used to register your EU registration? That seems to be something which is of concern to EU citizens. Could he confirm one way or the other?
Thank you, Member, for that intervention. She's raised a point that I am not aware of, and it's not really for me to answer that point. She may like to address that, and the Minister may respond to that later. But I wasn't aware of that, but I'm sure she raises a very valid and important point. We need to have an immigration system that is effective and fair. I know many of my parliamentary colleagues are of the same belief that we need a robust and competent immigration system that is also fair and humane to people seeking to legally enter and settle in this country. We have to send clear messages to discourage illegal immigration, and indeed this and previous governments have taken steps to be tough in tackling illegal immigration. I believe the British public want the government to be tough on illegal immigration. But we also need to be clear, this issue is not about illegal immigration. And to seek to make this issue about the way the government handles illegal migrants is missing the heart of the point, I believe. The Windrush generation are not here illegally, and they never have been. In this case, well-meaning policies have been applied to the wrong people with devastating consequences on the lives of our citizens. There are clearly lessons that we have to learn from this. But if the reaction to this is that we weaken our stance on illegal immigration, I believe we will be doing a disservice to the British people. There does, I believe, need to be a change of culture at the heart of the Home Office, because the focus has been on policy and processes and not on people. We must never lose sight of the fact that at the heart of these policies are people, individuals and families who deserve to be treated fairly with dignity and respect. It is right that immigration needs to be managed. Immigration cannot be uncontrolled, but managing immigration can be just and compassionate. This is challenging, but I believe it is essential we get it right. We must have a just and fair immigration system that works for the British people, that is open to people with the skills and talents to fill the much-needed shortages in our economy, and be compassionate to the most vulnerable, the persecuted and the displaced. We owe the Windrush generation a huge debt of gratitude for a number of things. For coming to help our nation at a time of need, for the contribution they have made to our nation for the past 70 years, for the lessons they have taught us and the way they have played an important part in shaping modern Britain as a tolerant, multicultural nation. But I suspect that we will soon owe them another thank you. Through this terrible experience that I know has been painful and caused distress for many, they are teaching us again a very important lesson. They are forcing us to look at the country we want to be in the future. They are making us look at the consequences, no matter how unintentional, of the way we handle immigration. And they are reminding us of our values that made us into the great nation of the modern era in the post-war world. These are important lessons, and this is an important time for us to be reminded of them. In closing, Mr. Austin, allow me to reiterate the crucial message that we want to send to all Commonwealth citizens who have legally chosen to make Britain their home. You are a vital part of this country, and we are immensely grateful for the contributions that you have made to our culture, our economy, and our society over many years. You have helped make us the country we are. You and your children are welcome to stay here. We want you to stay, and we want to do everything we can to make sure that you feel welcome.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 216539 relating to people who entered the UK as minors between 1948 and 1971. David Lammy.
I'm very proud to stand here on behalf of the 178,000 people who signed this petition, and I'm proud to stand here on behalf of the 492 British citizens who arrived on Empire Windrush from Jamaica 70 years ago. I'm proud to stand here on behalf of the 72,000 British citizens who arrived on the shores between the passage of the 1948 Nationality Act and the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrations Act, including my own father, who arrived from Guyana in 1956. But it's a very dark episode in our nation's history that this petition was even required. It's a very dark day indeed that we are here in Parliament having to stand up for the rights for people who have always given so much this country and expected so little in return. Mr. Austin, we need to remember our history at this moment. In Britain, when we talk about slavery, we tend to talk about its abolition, and particularly William Wilberforce. The Windrush story does not begin in 1948. The Windrush story begins in the 17th century, when British slave traders stole 12 million Africans from their homes, took them to the Caribbean, sold them into slavery to work on plantations. The wealth of this country was built on the backs of the Windrush generation's ancestors. We are here today because you were there. My ancestors were British subjects, but they were not British subjects because they came to Britain. They were British subjects because Britain came to them, took them across the Atlantic, colonised them, sold them into slavery, profited from their labour, and made them British subjects. That is why I am here, and that is why the Windrush generation is here. There is no British history without the history of the empire. And as the late, great Stuart Hall put it, I am the sugar at the bottom of the English cup of tea. And then 70 years ago, as Britain lay in ruins after the Second World War, the call went out to the colonies from the mother country. Britain asked the Windrush generation to come and rebuild the country, work in our National Health Service, work on the buses and on the trains, as cleaners, as security guards. So once again, Caribbean labour was used. They faced down the no blacks, no dogs, no Irish signs. They did the jobs nobody else wanted to do. They got spat at in the street. They were assaulted by teddy boys, the skinheads, the National Front, lived 5 to a room in Rachmanite squalor and housing. They were called and they served, but my God, did they suffer for the privilege of coming to this country. And yet, by God, they also triumphed. Sir Trevor MacDonald, Frank Bruno, Sir Lenny Henry, Jessica Ennis-Hill, national treasures, knights of the realms, heavyweight champions of the world, and Olympic champions wrapped in the British flag, sons and daughters of the Windrush generation, as British as they come. And after all of this, the government wants to send that generation back across the ocean. They want to make life hostile for the Windrush children, strip them of their rights, deny them healthcare, kick them out of their jobs, make them homeless, stop their benefits. And they are imprisoned in this country, as we've seen for those who are detained, centuries after their ancestors were shackled and taken across the ocean in slave ships, pensioners imprisoned in their own country. Mr. Austin, it's a disgrace, and it happened here because of a refusal to remember our history. Last week, the Prime Minister, at Prime Minister's Questions, said we owe it to them and the British people. The Home Secretary said that the Windrush generation should be considered British. They should be able to get their British citizenship if they so choose. This is the point the government simply does not understand. The Windrush generation are the British people. They are British citizens. They came here as citizens. That is the precise reason why this is such an injustice. Their British citizenship is and has always been theirs by right. It is not something that the government is now choosing to grant them. Can I remind the government of Chapter 56 of the 1948 British Nationality Act? It said, every person under this Act is a citizen of the United Kingdom and colonies, shall be, by virtue of that citizenship, have the status of British subject. The bill uses the term British nationality by virtue of citizenship. I read this bill again last week when reading over the case notes of my constituents caught up in the Windrush crisis. Patrick Henry, a British citizen, arrived in Britain in 1959, a teaching assistant who told me, I feel like a prisoner who has committed no crime because he is being denied citizenship. Clive Smith, a British citizen, arrived here in 1964, showed the Home Office's school reports and still threatened with deportation. Rosario Wilson, a British citizen, no right to be here because St. Lucia became independent in 1979. Wilberforce Sullivan, a British citizen, paid taxes for 40 years. He was told in 2011 he was no longer able to work. Dennis Laidley, a British citizen, tax records going back to the 1960s, denied a passport and unable to visit his sick mother. Geoffrey Greaves, a British citizen, arrived here in 1964, threatened with deportation by the Home Office. And Cecile Lureni-Cecine, a British citizen, 44 years of national insurance contributions to this country, payslips and bank account details going back over that time, her application for naturalisation rejected. And Huffley Seeley, a British citizen, unable to claim benefits or access healthcare in this country. Or Mark Balfour, a British citizen, arrived here in 1962, aged 7, refused access to benefit. The Windrush generation have waited for too long for the rights that are theirs. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over. There comes a time when the burden of living like a criminal in your own country becomes too heavy to bear any longer. And that is why we have seen in the last few weeks an outpouring of pain and grief built up over many years. And yet government ministers have tried to conflate the issue with illegal immigration. On Thursday, the Home Secretary said, "I am personally committed to tackling illegal migration, making it difficult for illegal migrants to live here and removing people who are here illegally." I won't give way, I'm just going to finish. Indeed, during her statement last Thursday, the Home Secretary said illegal 23 times, but did not even once say the word citizen. This is not about illegal immigration. This is about British citizens. And frankly, it's deeply offensive to conflate the Windrush generation with illegal immigrants to try and distract from the Windrush crisis. This is about a hostile environment policy that blurs the lines between illegal immigrants and people who are here legally and even British citizens. This is about a hostile environment not just for illegal immigrants, but for anybody who looks like they could be an immigrant. This is about a hostile environment that has turned employers, doctors, landlords and social workers into border guards. The hostile environment is not about illegal immigration. Increasing leave to remain fees by 238% in 4 years is not about illegal immigration. The Home Office making profits of 800% on standard applicants is not about illegal immigration. The Home Office sending back documents unrecorded in second-class posts so that passports, birth certificates and education certificates get lost is not about illegal immigration. Charging teenagers £2,033 for limited leave every 30 months is not about illegal immigration. Charging someone £10,521 in limited leave to remain fees before they can even apply for indefinite leave to remain is not about illegal immigration. Banning refugees and asylum seekers from working and preventing them from accessing public funds is not about illegal immigration. Sending 9 immigration enforcement staff to arrest my constituent because the Home Office lost his documents is not about illegal immigration. Locking my constituent up in Yarlswood so she missed her midwifery exams is not about illegal immigration. Denying legal aid to migrants who are here legally is not about illegal immigration. Changing the terms of young asylum seekers' immigration bail so they cannot study is not about illegal immigration. Sending immigration enforcement staff to a church in my constituency serving soup to refugees is not about illegal immigration. The Home Secretary and the Prime Minister have promised compensation. They have promised no enforcement action will be taken. They have promised that the burden of proof will be lowered when the task force is assessing Windrush cases. The Windrush citizens don't trust the Home Office, and I don't blame them after so much injustice that has been dealt out. I quote Martin Luther King, who himself quoted St. Augustine when he said that an unjust law is no law at all. So I say to the Minister, warm words mean nothing. Guarantee these rights and enshrine them in law as soon as possible, and review a hostile environment that turns everybody that is different in this country into someone who is potentially illegal. And 230 years after the abolitionist movement wore their medallions around their neck, I stand here as a Caribbean, black, British citizen, and I ask the Minister on behalf of those Windrush citizens, am I not a man and a brother?
Order, order. I'm sorry, but we're not supposed to have applause. I mean, I understand how strongly people feel about this, but I'm afraid that's the rules. Alex Chalk.
Thank you very much, and I want to also begin by paying tribute to Mr. Vernon, the petitioner. So there's a great deal in what the Honourable Gentleman for Tottenham said that I think everyone of conscience and sensitivity and feeling can agree with wholeheartedly. On any view, this has been a shocking episode, and it has inspired feelings of some shame. Shame because this is not the country we are, these are not our values, and this is not the kind of country we aspire to be. And forgive me for repeating a point which does bear emphasis, but where I entirely agree with the Honourable Member for Tottenham. The Windrush generation are British. They are part of the warp and weft of this nation. They have made a profound contribution in business, in science, in commerce, in sport, in industry. And we all feel a profound sense of distress at the way that some individuals, far too many individuals, have been impacted. And it's right that we do pause to think, how did it come to this? And it is important to somehow step back and to look in a little granularity, in a little detail about what happened. And it seems that the Immigration Act, 1971, provided that those who arrived before it came into force should be treated as having indefinite leave to remain, despite the fact that they didn't have that specific documentation. And of course, what we know happened afterwards is that you required the document in the passport or whatever it was. And it's now tolerably plain, is it not, Mr. Austin, that in attempts to clamp down on illegal immigration, we have led to unintended and wholly unacceptable consequences. The system has failed. It is acted indiscriminately and in a way that causes us the shame that I mentioned. But if we are to derive a small sense of solace, I have been encouraged to some extent to hear the response of the government. There has been no attempt to deny that this was wrong, no attempt to pretend that the system has worked as it should, no attempt to deny the impact, which is profound, and a fairly, if I may put it, grovelling acknowledgement, Mr. Austin, that the system has gone wrong. And I think we do take some small comfort too in seeing the speed and robustness of the response. Quite rightly, by the way. So the task force has been set up to help applicants, not to hinder them, but to help them demonstrate that they are entitled to live in the UK. Quite right. Tasked with resolving that case inside 2 weeks, because for individuals like Elwaldo Romeo, who was referred to with great articulacy by my honourable friend, it must be a peculiar form of torture almost to feel that the Home Office could come knocking. So these cases must be resolved quickly, because justice delayed is justice denied. No language tests, quite right. No cost, quite right. A helpline, quite right. And also, importantly, for those who've made their lives here but have retired to their country of origin, they must be able to come back to the UK, fees must be waived, and it's right also that the government is working with embassies and high commissions to make that so. What is the net effect of all this? It means that anyone from the Windrush generation who now wants to become a British citizen can. The net effect is that the burden of proof has, in effect, been shifted. And yes, something that was adverted to by the Honourable Gentleman from Tottenham, compensation, that should be run by an independent person, and I understand that is the government's intention. So yes, this has gone wrong, but it's absolutely right that the government has acted decisively without seeking to cavil or deny or shift the blame onto anyone else. Where I do respectfully, and with great and genuine respect, apply a slightly different context to the points that the Honourable Gentleman was making, is I think we have to recognise, when speaking about this issue of illegal immigration, is in emphasising why there is a distinction, to explain why there is that distinction. And the reason why we draw the distinction is because illegal immigration as distinct from those who came here in the Windrush generation and subsequently, encourages exploitation of the most vulnerable. It is a cruel and pernicious way to behave. And second, it is unfair on those who play by the rules and do the right thing. And those include, by the way, people from the Windrush generation who, exactly as he indicated, with great articulacy, answered the call of Britain to come here to our country, to help, to work, to support, to build. They did the right thing. And the truth is that some of the most vociferous critics of those who try to game the system, who get round it, who try to bend the rules, are often those people who played by the rules, come to this country and done the right thing. So we must draw that distinction, not just because it's right, but because it's fair to those who've played by the rules. And the other point is, we should not seek to infantilize people by suggesting that the rhetoric on being tough on illegal immigration is new. It is not. And it's entirely appropriate that we have, in the past, governments of all stripes acted and talked tough. Let us take a moment just to consider what is applied. In 1982, under a Conservative government, the NHS began treatment charges for illegal immigrants. Well, that has the advantage of common sense, you might think, to those people who've come here legally who need to feel that they are getting the proper share of public services and they're not being wrongly diverted. If I could just finish this point and then I will return. 1997, the government instituted checks by employers on someone's right to work here. In 1999, measures were imposed on access to benefits. We're now into a Labour government, of course. And in 2008, civil penalties were imposed for those who employed illegal migrants of up to £10,000. Now, I don't criticise any of that. But to suggest that this has emerged from a clear blue sky is misleading, and it is unfair to those who are in the eye of this storm.
It's a point which those listening to the debate won't necessarily know, that on health care, emergency treatment is available to all, regardless of who they are. It's more routine and elective care, where the checks right clear there. I'm not criticising my old friend, let's make sure that people understand that no one gets denied emergency care in this country.
I'm very grateful to my friend for clarifying that point, and it's absolutely right that he has done so. But the point I wanted to make by way of context is these are measures that have accrued over time, and I'm grateful to him for that point of detail. And I'm not going to quote what I'm about to quote in the interest of inflaming matters, because I don't think we should be in the business of inflaming matters. I think we should be in the business of cold, cool assessment. But my honourable friend was right when he quoted an immigration minister from 2007 who described his policy as flushing illegal migrants out and trying to create a more hostile environment in this country if you are here illegally. Now, I don't actually think at the time that was a particularly unreasonable thing to say. And it was John Reeder's Home Secretary who said, we need to make living and working here illegally ever more uncomfortable and constrained. So the reality is governments of all stripes have talked tough and have acted tough. And so all I really wanted to say is this. This is a shameful episode. It is, as has been indicated, it is error, not conspiracy. It is incumbent upon this government, because this government happens to be in office, to get it right. But we owe it to the people of this country, whether they are here from the Windrush generation or elsewhere, to look at this coolly, frankly, and above all, fairly.
Thank you. Siobhan McDonough.
Thank you, Mr. Austin. I would like to say to the people who came here, who are our teachers, our nurses, our cleaners, our carers, our bus drivers, our train drivers, thank you. London would not be the city it is today. My part of London, the best part of London, that is South London, would not be what it is today, but for the Windrush generation. Until I was 4, I did not understand that there were any other countries than Ireland, England, and those in the Caribbean. because my mum was of the earlier generation to the Windrush. In 1947, she came here to train as a nurse and worked in mental health for the rest of her working life. All her friends in nursing were from Ireland or from the Caribbean. They were the only people who wanted to work in the large psychiatric hospital of the 60s, 70s and 80s. But I'm here today not to in any way compete with the amazing oratory of my right honourable friend for Tottenham, but to try and get justice for 3 of my constituents. I have been racking my brain, Mr. Austin, since this came to the fore, to think about those people who came to see me, who could have been treated unjustly because of this, and how they can now seek support. I would like to raise to the Minister the case of Kenneth Ellis. Ken is 62. He came to the UK in 1962, aged 8, to join his parents, Herman and Ivy Ellis, both of whom were UK citizens. He still has his dad's UK passport and birth certificate. He attended schools in Wandsworth. For a short period, sadly, he was in care to Wandsworth Council. He first came to see me in 2013, and I tried to find out how I could help him provide proof of his residency in the UK, backdated to 62. That sounds an awful lot easier than it actually is. I contacted the Inland Revenue, and they said, yes, they had records, but they couldn't release them back to 1962 unless asked for them by the Home Office. I contacted Wandsworth Council, but informed me that they didn't keep records of that age. I was told perhaps if you could get the landing card of when he arrived, that could help. But we now know that those landing cards were destroyed. As a result of the last 5 years of attempting to define his status in a country where he has lived for over 50 years, he has been unable to work, his relationship has broken down, and he has lost his home. Trevor. I've only known about Trevor since April the 13th. His mum and dad, Islin and Grafton, came to London from Barbados in 1961. Islin qualified as a nurse at St Peter's Hospital, Chertsey, in 1965, and Trevor joined them in 1967, aged 8, arriving with his grandmother, Myrtle. In the last 50 years, Trevor has never left England. He may never have left Mitcham, for all I know. He worked for the Blue Arrow Agency for years, only taking time off when Islin became unwell and he wanted to care for her. As a result of an administrative error with Blue Arrow Agency, he was sent his P45. On receipt of it, he could no longer work because any employer he went to, even Blue Arrow that he returned to, he did not have the paperwork to ensure that he could work, so nobody would take him on. As a result of this, he has been out of work for the last 18 months, reliant upon his 83-year-old mother. Neville. Neville is slightly different. He came to Britain in 1973, aged 17, to join his parents, Thomas and Deslin, both of whom were UK citizens. And to prove this, I have their UK expired passports. Looking at this passport, on behalf of Deslin, it said, I, Kenneth Blackburn, Knight Commander of the most distinguished order, excuse me, my glasses, of St. Michael and St. George, Officer of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, Captain General and Governor-in-Chief in and over the island of Jamaica and its dependency, request and require the name of Her Majesty, all those who may concern, to allow the bearer to pass freely without let or hindrance, and to afford every assistance and protection of which she may stand in need, given at King's House in the island of Jamaica on the 19th day of April, 1961. His father's passport, given by Geoffrey Camel-Gunter, Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, issued at King's House in the island of Jamaica, the 6th of July, 1960. Yet Neville cannot define his immigration status. He has spent money. He has had pro bono support. He has been evicted from his home. He has not been allowed to work. He has not been allowed to claim benefits. I have chased the Home Office for the last 6 years to try and sort out his immigration status, and I am ashamed to say that to date I have failed. Neville now cares full-time for his mother in order to allow his siblings the right to go and work, knowing that their mum is cared for. But it is simply not right that Neville should have been treated in this way, or that his parents should have been treated in this way. All we are asking for is justice and the right to go out and work and support themselves for these 3 men in the way that their parents taught them.
Simon Hoare.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Austin. It's a pleasure to serve both under your chairmanship and to follow the Honourable Lady from Richmond Morden, who made an incredibly powerful and moving speech, which we all will have heard here this afternoon. The Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Tottenham, was absolutely right, Mr. Austin, when he pointed out that we can't forget history. And we shouldn't try to forget history, warts and all, the good and the bad. And any nation which tries to pretend that all of its history is one or the other is a nation that is not at ease with itself and is trying to fool its residents. And I think it is important for both parties to remember really where quite a lot of this stuff came from. If we go back to the middle to the end of the Blair-Brown premiership and then in the early days of the coalition, both of the main principal parties in this country had become terrified of either the BNP or of UKIP. We saw them nibbling away at our bases. We saw them pandering to prejudices, very often long held, but very rarely spoken of. We saw it in industrial areas. We saw it in all sorts of areas in this country. And I don't like using the phrase dog whistle politics, because I always think it's a bit of a dull instrument or blunt instrument to use. But to an extent, governments of both persuasions, both colours, were under the most enormous pressure to be tough. And sometimes the resolve of principled mainstream politicians to kick back against that, to face it down, to say why that narrative was wrong, we slightly lost our nerves. And I'm absolutely concerned that just as that concern grew, so some of the policies have been put in place by both governments, which in hindsight might have been phrased a little better, should have been thought of a little more deeply. Now, my honourable friend, the member for Cheltenham, who I thought in an incredibly powerful speech, thoughtful and sensible as are his hallmarks, was right to draw our attention to some of those quotes from Labour ministers involved with either the Home Office or immigration, where the noble Lord Reid had said as Home Secretary, and I quote, "We need to make living and working here illegally ever more uncomfortable and constrained." We've heard of the Right Honourable Member, the member for Hodge Hill, who when as Immigration Minister said, and I quote, "What we are proposing here will, I think, flush illegal migrants out. We are trying to create a much more hostile environment if you are here illegally." And I intervened on my honourable friend, the member for Newquay and St Austell, to draw our attention back to those different definitions. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, my right honourable friend, the Immigration Minister, the former Home Secretary, the current Home Secretary, the Right Honourable Lady, the Chairman of the Home Affairs Selects Committee, who's joined us, and all of us, I think, should be and must be at the most enormous pains to point out that division of public policy. All of us will have been annoyed and irritated over the years when we have entered into debates with members of the public, they could be constituents of ours or not, where the conflation of, let's say, asylum seekers, refugees, legal immigrants, illegal immigrants, all gets put into one particular pot instead of looking at the silos and the policies that flow from it. My right honourable friends who are involved in the Home Office and at the very head of government have made clear the government's shame at what has happened and their apology. And I cannot think, Mr. Austin, of a single colleague on our benches who would demur from that position. I happen to be one of those Conservatives that has been perfectly relaxed about immigration and the freedom of movement. As somebody who is a quarter Irish, a quarter Greek, and half Welsh, how could I not be relaxed about immigration? As somebody who was born and brought up in Cardiff, with those marvellous docks, which was a huge melting pot for the nations of the world as they came to work and grow our South Wales economy, enriching South Wales not just financially, but culturally as well. A huge debt of gratitude. But we do have to be clear. We must not throw the baby out with the bathwater by conflating yet again the very clear legal definitions of legal migration and illegal migration. The Windrush generation are not becoming British citizens, as the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Tottenham, has said. They are British citizens, and the law seeks to confirm those rights and privileges in law. We've moved too much, not just in this arena of public policy, but right the way across the piece, be it central or local government, to use that Little Britain phrase, the computer says no. The boxes are either ticked or they're not ticked, and we must, in any arrangement which we now move forward to, ensure that there is the opportunity, the space, if you will, for both officials who are dealing with these matters, often very complex, and indeed for ministers, to have more discretion and discernment in taking these important decisions. Because as the member for North Dorset, Mr. Austin, who has never had his right to be in this country questioned, we can only, can we envisage? I'm not entirely sure that we can envisage how people's lives must have felt not just turned upside down, but inside out, like one of those sort of snow dome things, shaken so that the whole picture of what people have recognised as their everyday lives has just got so distorted they cannot recognise it, feeling like an alien in their own country. That I do not believe, and I take the point which was raised, I believe, by my honourable friend, my honourable friend, the member for Henley, forgive me, on the opening speech of my honourable friend, the member for Newquay. You either fall into the cock-up or the conspiracy theory. And I would be the first to stand up and say that I believe something was a conspiracy. And I do not. I think this is just genuinely, absolutely genuinely, an oversight. Now, an oversight is a trivial word possibly to use. It in no way encompasses the whole emotional gamut of how people have had to respond to these issues. But I take the most enormous comfort that we are seeking as a government to put it right. And as the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Tottenham, reminded us and as I pointed out in my opening remarks, we shouldn't forget history, nor should we seek to rewrite the welcome, or actually rather sometimes the lack of it, that those first Windrush generation received. You know, the posters in the B&Bs in Kensington and Notting Hill and the Portobello Road of no Irish, no dogs, no blacks. And it was always the blacks who were at the bottom of the list. The dogs were actually preferred to having black people coming to stay. The colour bar and all of those things, access to housing, the Rachmanisation of the London housing stock. So we shouldn't delude ourselves, Mr. Austin, that these people who answered, and I use the phrase that the Right Honourable Gentleman for Tottenham made, who answered the clarion call of the mother country, just as they had answered in time of war, so they answered in time of peace. And the battlefields of the First and the Second World War were not just stained indelibly with the blood of white Anglo-Saxons, they were stained indelibly with the blood of empire, who realized that the values that we were trying to defend, the foe that we were trying to deter and defeat, was right. And it was right for them to come and fight alongside us. I'm never quite certain that that debt has ever been truly recognised. The speech of 1968, as we all know, cast a very big shadow over the whole immigration debate. And very often, people would veer away from discussing immigration in fear of being accused of having racial or racist tendencies. We have moved on from that. But by golly, when these events come about, we have to pause and just remind ourselves and reinforce that this is not a debate which is in any way anchored by some racial prejudice or some sort of racial agenda. I didn't like the phrase that illegals would be flushed out, but I fully support, as do I believe, the vast majority of those who are here legally, irrespective of colour, that we need to be firm and resolute in our approach to migration to this country, for the reasons which my honourable friend for Cheltenham alluded. We need to make sure that those who are here legally are given the warm embrace of a friend and neighbour, where we recognise entirely the unquantifiable contribution that they make to our society, not just economically, but socially, culturally, from a community base as well. My right honourable friend, the Minister, is all too aware of the scale of the task and the speed with which that task needs to be completed, as is our right honourable friend, the member for Bromsgrove, who I welcome in his new position as Home Secretary. Let nobody, Mr. Austin, be under any illusion of the seriousness and determination of Her Majesty's government, not just to resolve this problem properly, promptly and speedily, but to ensure that the computer says no response and that this sort of problem doesn't arise again.
Very grateful, Mr. Austin. It's an absolute pleasure to serve and speak with you in the chair. Can I start also by thanking Patrick Vernon, OBE, for launching this position, for creating the space we urgently needed to discuss these awful and totally avoidable events. I'd also like to pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for Tottenham, for his exceptional speech and his tireless advocacy on this issue. The MP for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford for her forensic and interrogation and analysis of the former Home Secretaries and actions, and the MP for Hackney North and Stoke Newington, who has so effectively led on the issue from the front bench. Let me make this clear. This issue is personal to me. For so, like many Londoners, I have family who are part of the Windrush generation. Lucy and her husband Cecil came here to help rebuild Britain. Lucy as a fabulous, dedicated, caring nurse who worked her whole life in the NHS, and Cecil as a skilled artisan. So before I start, I want to say thank you to Lucy and Cecil for all they've done, and to all the Lucy and Cecils who came, who worked, and who served our country, often sadly in brutal, racist circumstances.
My honourable friend was making a powerful speech about the importance of the Windrush generation to this whole country, to our public services and economy. And would she join with me as well in not just thanking all those who have helped build our country, but also those who have actually been so badly and shamefully hit by what's gone wrong in the Home Office, but have had the bravery and strength to speak out, including telling their stories to the newspapers and to Amelia Gentleman, who has obviously played such an important role in telling their stories.
I certainly do, and I thank my honourable friend for that. Cecil and Lucy really believed that they could make this country a home and that it would be fit for their children and their grandchildren. And they did. They thought that they had secured for themselves and their children a place that was welcoming, warm. But I can assure you their family is angry now, because the contract they had with this country has been broken by this careless, callous government. Their faith in this country has been crushed. They and their children and their grandchildren feel betrayed. And it's not just my family who are angered by this betrayal. Many of my constituents, whether they have family among the Windrush generation or not, believe that this Prime Minister's policies have betrayed a generation of their friends, their neighbours and their families. And I don't know how many of my constituents have been caught up by the Home Office's hostile immigration strategy, because many have not made their way to my door yet. But I'm urging them to do so that I can help them to sort this situation out. One of them, who I will call Jem, contacted me early last year. Jem travelled from Jamaica in 1969 and has lived here legally ever since. But in August last year, his housing benefit suddenly stopped on the basis that he had no recourse to public funds. This was certainly new to him. Jem hasn't kept hold of every official document that's come through his door for the last several decades. So when the Home Office demanded evidence for every single year he'd lived here, he was understandably devastated and overwhelmed. And I don't think many of us could produce that much evidence on demand. I certainly couldn't. Jem was told he'd have to secure a new passport from Jamaica at great expense, at a time when he was unable to work. The £2,500 fee for naturalisation was well out of question. He's now facing eviction due to rent arrears, and he tells me he has to report regularly to the immigration centre as if he was a criminal. A few days ago, Jem's daughter called the new hotline and is still waiting to be called back. I've contacted the Immigration Minister on Jem's behalf and will be happy to give her his details after this debate. But Jem's not the only constituent who has been harmed by this hostile environment. Jessica travelled to Britain in 1970 from Dominica. She's 58 now, but still remembers an immigration officer stamping her passport with the words "indefinite right to remain." She grew up in this country and she has worked and paid taxes for the last 39 years. But last month, she was fired from a local charity which supports migrants and refugees on the basis she couldn't prove her right to work in the UK. A bitter irony that a person who has worked to help those at risk because of immigration policies has now fallen victim to those policies herself. She said, "I've always been a positive person, but this is frankly a terrible situation." I don't think anybody would have failed to notice the former Home Secretary's oft-repeated use of the phrase compliant environment last week. But as my friend, the Honourable Member for Garston and Hellwood said, whether it's compliance or hostility, the policy has still led to a debacle. Jem and Jessica will receive absolutely no comfort if I tell them, though they've nearly lost everything, the government didn't mean to be hostile. Cold comfort, because let's be in no doubt, this scandal is leaving a legacy of fear and anxiety amongst communities and the individuals it has betrayed. Nevertheless, I welcome the government's pledges to waive fees for members of the Windrush generation as they apply for documents and rightful naturalisation, to scrap the requirement for a citizen test and the free services they've created for the victims. Absolutely the right thing to do. But the problem stems from the policy itself. The hostile environment has been hardened over time in the service of an arbitrary target. This is hardly the way to encourage careful evaluation of an individual's rights. The canned response we keep hearing from the government is that the Windrush generation are different, are an exception. We know the phrase, the exception proves the rule, because there are now new cases coming to light of British citizens from other backgrounds who've been caught up by this government's approach. So how many exceptions does it take before the rule is changed? Well, cases that don't appear as Windrush need to make their own headlines before they're recognised. If so, that's not only nonsensical, it's cruel. The right to appeal through an immigration tribunal was scrapped for most cases by 2014. When there's no longer recourse to legal aid on top, the inevitable wrong decisions are so much harder to challenge. And I hope that the new Home Secretary will fix this matter as an urgency, though I don't hold my breath. Regret, no matter how bitter, no matter how heartfelt, cannot take the place of substantial policy change. It's simply not good enough to redress the consequences each time after the fact. Policy change is the only way to stop this happening again. But that won't undo the damage already done. That pain will never go away. This petition is rightly calling on the government to take into account loss and hurt. The loss of a job, benefits, of medical treatment, of pensions, of citizenship, that can be measured. Thank you.
Right. Does she agree with me that the compensation scheme, we hope, will be put in place sooner rather than later? Because people some people have been detained, some people have been deprived healthcare, some people have been deprived benefits, and they've also gone through terrible anguish during the time that this scandal has been going on.
My honourable friend is obviously right, of course, because we can possibly put a financial value on the financial loss that jobs, benefits, etc. is there. But the hurt, the loss of faith and the impact on the deep betrayal is much more complex, much more difficult to assess in monetary value. So I ask the Minister, whoever is appointed to run the compensation scheme is encouraged to think long and hard about the lifetime impact of those losses. The Windrush generation undoubtedly made a huge contribution to rebuilding our country. Many of them fought in the war. They came at the government's invitation. They stayed at the government's invitation, and they worked year after year after year because they were needed. So there is a real stench of betrayal about these recent events. I am lucky. I am so lucky. I have an amazing family. Not only Cecil and Lucy, who have done so much for this country, but their children too, including my brother-in-law Colin, who I love to bits. and his daughter, my niece Amy, who I love more than life itself. My family have been lucky not to fall victim to the changed immigration laws, but make no mistake, we are really very angry. We are furious. We need more from the government. We need mistakes to be rectified quickly with generous compensation, and we need less dangerous policies coming from this government. It's now time for the Prime Minister, as the architect of the hostile environment policy, to take responsibility, because it's her policy, it's her watch, and it's for her to be held to account.
Leo Doherty.
Thank you, Mr. Rawson. I'm very grateful to serve on your chairmanship today, and I'm very pleased to be able to speak in this important debate. I'm going to speak relatively briefly, but first of all, I'd like to just declare that I entirely support the sentiment of this petition today, Mr. Rawson, and as the Member of Parliament for Aldershot, with a very significant population with a Commonwealth background across Aldershot and Farnborough and the borough of Rushmore, who have built their lives in the borough and contribute a great deal at every professional level. I'm someone who is very pleased to put on record my appreciation of the contribution this population make. And of course, Aldershot as a borough shares a longer history with our Commonwealth, going back to the late 19th century, when a very great number of imperial troops were stationed in the garrison. So the contribution that our Commonwealth population has made has, of course, as has already been said today, has a very, very long historical precedence. And now, today, members of our community with mainly Indian and Pakistani heritage live with a very significant Nepalese community, and that's something of which I'm extremely proud. Mr. Rawson, we've heard some very eloquent and some, frankly, moving speeches today, but I would like to just touch on, rather than on the words around this, and rather than the rhetoric surrounding the issue, I'd like to just touch briefly on the action that the government has taken in the last few days and weeks. And I'm very grateful that we have the Minister here today, who I'm sure will offer further reassurance about the series of actions the government has taken so far. Mr. Rawson, I think firstly it's very important that the government has waived the citizenship fee for anyone who wishes to apply for citizenship, and the fact that that applies to those who have no documentation and also those who have it. I think the waiving for the requirement to have a knowledge of language test is important, and I think it's important that the children of the Windrush generation will be able to apply to naturalise at no cost. I think it's also important that those who have lived here for a very long time but then gone back to their country of origin are able to come back, and the fees associated with this will also be waived. Mr. Rawson, I'm encouraged that we have a dedicated team helping identify and gather evidence to confirm the existence of individuals' right to be in the UK, and I'd be very grateful for any updates that the Minister might provide on the latest actions taken by this task force. I understand that as of last week, 23 people had already got the documentation they need, with nearly 100 appointments booked to help more people. I'm very encouraged by that, but any further update from the Minister would be much appreciated. I'm pleased also, Mr. Rawson, that no one affected will be charged for any documentation which proves their right to be here, and anyone who wishes to obtain a formal residence card can do so free of cost. I'm reassured, given the emotions around this subject, which we've heard described and very eloquently today, that there will be no removals or detention as part of any assistance to help citizens involved in this process to get their proper documentation. I think that's very important that we put that on record, and that's clearly understood. I'm also reassured, Mr. Rawson, by the fact that a new website will provide information and guidance for people who need the support, and will give examples of the type of evidence required for the formal process. I think in addition to those series of actions, I think it's really important now that the government gets the tone right on this. And that's why earlier today I was very encouraged, while in the chambers, to see the new Home Secretary very clearly outline the fact that this was of highest importance, and he did it in quite personal terms. And he said that when it comes to dealing with this issue, he said it could have been my mother, my brother, or me. So the new Home Secretary, he gets this. He gets the emotional importance of this, and he gets the sense of justice that I think people associated with the Windrush generation want to see fulfilled. He said in the chamber, I will do whatever it takes to get this right. We will do right by the Windrush generation. And he went on to say, I am a second-generation migrant too. And he was referring to the Shadow Home Secretary, saying that she doesn't have a monopoly on anger. And that's very true. And I think the only response now should, while there is, of course, justifiable anger, I think the response from the government needs to be one of very calm, compassionate efficiency. I'm reassured that the government will resolve this episode in a serious and determined manner, but also in an empathetic and gracious manner. Thank you, Mr. Austin.
Pleasure to serve under your chairship. I would argue that in many ways our debates over the Windrushes have been too small, too fixated on destroyed immigration documents or who knew what when. Like EU citizens, the interests of the Windrush citizens have not been given the attention they should have been afforded. They have been afterthoughts as far as too many UK politicians are concerned. The political game has seemed more important than the people whose lives are affected, and the point scoring more important than sorting it out. But the debates are too small in another way too. They are about a group of cases, about the symptoms of a policy malfunction, not about the policy malfunction itself. It is not, as was suggested earlier, simply a structural problem in the Home Office. The anti-immigration rhetoric of successive UK governments has created an environment of xenophobic mistrust, hate and fear. The go-home vans that the Prime Minister created in her previous post of Home Secretary were a development from Gordon Brown's British Jobs for British Workers. We know too that the government of Clement Attlee wasn't the benign, welcoming and inclusive regime as has been painted recently. We know that the ministers in that government wanted immigration to be a temporary phenomenon. I'm afraid I cannot agree with the Honourable Member for North Dorset on this, although I welcome many of his very measured remarks on this topic. Racism runs deep in the political psyche here. There is a bias that is embedded in the minds of many politicians that will not be easily dislodged. Windrush isn't some isolated case and isn't an aberration or a deviation from the norm. Windrush fits right into the institutional racism of this place, from Attlee's minister's attempts to turn the ship away, to the 1971 Immigration Act, and on to this vicious, hostile environment of the current government. There is a thread of hate linking the attitudes of each generation. That attitude has driven public perceptions too. The casual racism that we see all too often. The Right Honourable Member for Hackney North can testify to that, I believe, with the appalling flood of bile that is directed at her. Even with that evidence so easily available to us, all the attitudes persist here. That has driven the debate on a number of issues, not least of which has been the debate over our relationship with the EU. For all that nonsense about that bus with the promise to pay the NHS millions every week, the main driver of the Leave debate was racist, an argument of exceptionalism, an opinion that we are somehow better than everyone else. And it's continued into the aftermath too, with the disregard that the government showed for the worries and concerns of EU citizens concerned for their futures here. Treated as pawns, they are left with no certainty over their positions post-Brexit. People who have also contributed to our communities, paid their taxes, made society better, built lives and their future here, dispossessed by a government that seems determined to fight Agincourt again. 3 million people who, like the Windrush generation, live, work, study, pay taxes and contribute to society here, had their lives thrown into question. EU citizens have been packing up and leaving ahead of Brexit, shutting down businesses, resigning from the NHS, leaving their research labs in universities. Now that damages Scotland. We need the people who will help run our services, build businesses, support our academic sector and build our future. People who come to share Scotland are as welcome as they are necessary, and we need them. The attitude of the current government is disgraceful. It has targets for deporting immigrants. Now just imagine that. Not targets as in this person or those people shouldn't be allowed to stay, but targets as in 8,337 per year. What could possibly be the driver for that other than racism, a sense of exceptionalism, an attitude that we are somehow better than others? Yes.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way. I fear that she's fallen into the trap that I alluded to during my speech of conflating legal and illegal. I think most people in this country, including legal migrants, would say that any government has a duty and a responsibility to ensure that everybody who is here legally. And whether that means setting targets to remove those who should not be here, most people actually support that policy, irrespective of their national heritage.
I'm afraid I would not be able to agree with the Honourable Member on that particular point. I mean, from attitudes to gypsy travellers in debates here, which have literally caused my mouth to drop open in astonishment and horror, from the comments made by Right Honourable and Honourable Members, to case after case in my constituency office of most appalling treatment of EU nationals and non-EU nationals alike by the UKVI and the Home Office. And my contention is that that attitude comes from successive UK governments towards the issue of immigration on the whole. As I was saying, successive UK governments have created an atmosphere of mistrust and fear, and they are proud of it. The current Prime Minister even praises the hostile environment. You know, they have thought that they have tapped into a source of votes by painting immigrants as some kind of threat to an imaginary British way of life. And now Windrush is blowing up the dust of the UK's imperial past. People who came to these islands as British citizens are being deported. People who came here half a century ago are being told to go home. The vans may be gone, but the attitude hasn't. They are being told to go back to countries they wouldn't recognise now. Their children and grandchildren are also targeted, people who were born in the UK and have never lived anywhere else. Some have already been deported, some have declared themselves stateless to avoid deportation. Many more are living in fear that their lives are about to be utterly broken. These are people who came here when there were labour shortages here. They worked, paid their taxes, built lives and communities. They had children who worked, paid their taxes and built on that legacy. There are grandchildren doing the same. Now, the UK is unlikely to change anytime soon, frankly, Mr. Robertson. But Scotland needs immigrants. We need population growth. We need the energy and the impetus that comes with them. Our country is damaged by the right-wing xenophobia of the deportation, the document checks and the fear-mongering. EU citizens and Windrush people shouldn't be discouraged or deterred. They should be welcomed and encouraged. This debate is less than it should be. It should be an in-depth and unflinching analysis of the continuing racism of the body politic here. That is our shame and our disgrace, and we should not be content to hand it on to future generations.
So Peter Bottomley.
To be called. I'm sorry I wasn't here at the beginning. I was taking part in the questions in the chamber of the House of Commons when a statement had been asked for. Can I say to my brother, that man, that I was honoured to be at his wedding, and I probably ought to declare that I stand as godfather to the aunt of his children. I also am proud to have known Sam King, who with Arthur Torrington got the Windrush Foundation going and the Equiano Society 21 years ago. And I may be fortunate that the people I know who I regard as the Windrush generation as a way of embracing a large number of people are people who've been bishops in my church, who've been head teachers in my schools, and who've held every kind of job across the spectrum of our society. What we have lost, I think, in this debate is not... What we've found in this debate is too many people saying the other side didn't get things right. What we've lost is a sense of what each of us can do to try to make sure we do get it right. So some of the lessons I've learned have come from a book by Will Somerville, published... it covered Labour's immigration policy, as they call it, Immigration Under New Labour, published by Policy Press at the University of Bristol, covering 1997 to 2007. So not the full period. And in chapters 16, 17 and 18, there's quite a lot of talk about targets. In the days when I served as a junior minister and my wife served as a more senior minister, people laughed at us because we would have between 3 and 11 boxes over a weekend. And various people said to us, why do we read what's put in front of us? And the answer is because we can find that voice among public officials or the outsider who says, please look at this, it isn't sensible, it isn't right. I was going to appear on Newsnight a few days ago, but got bounced because the subject of the Windrush generation was less important than the future retirement of the manager of Arsenal Football Club. To some people, it may be the right sense of priorities. To me, it lost my opportunity of saying, as most people now say, for many people who are affected by the way the system has worked, albeit for a minority, but that minority matters just as much as if it were a majority, that you should not be saying to people who've lived here at peace, paying taxes, registered to vote, contributing, as British nationals, you have to prove for 4 elements of your life for each year for the last 40 years what you're doing. I couldn't do that. Why should they have to do it? The presumption ought to be that if you have obviously been here for long enough to qualify as a recognised British national, as a subject citizen, you shouldn't have to go find all these bits of documents. That you should say, look, were this person to have been on the electoral register for the last 15 years, if it's quite clear that they came out of a school, here they are in a confirmation class, here they are in the guides or the scouts, here they are at a college or university, or a recognised training, or even just as a taxpayer, the Inland Revenue know who's been paying taxes, the Department of Work and Pensions know who's been paying national insurance. If that, on the face of it, shows that they have absolutely no chance of being an illegal immigrant who's come in the last 2 or 3 years, they should be granted British citizenship formally, recognising what was formally right anyway. And I say this to people, and this may be, I don't want to criticise the media because we rely on them. What on earth was that nonsense about the landing cards about? British subjects didn't complete landing cards. We didn't do it. So the fact that they were destroyed or may have been destroyed is totally irrelevant. And that should have been obvious to anyone doing work experience in a newspaper, let alone someone who's in one of our great news organisations, the Press Association, the BBC. You sort out between one of you.
Well, he says that, but my constituent, Paulette Wilson, in 2015, was sent a letter out of the blue from the Home Office telling her that her entry into the UK, there was no evidence of her entry into the UK, despite the fact that they had destroyed that evidence.
Okay.
Sorry, but in the case of Trevor, Ken and Neville, if they had had those landing cards, that would have been proof of their entry.
Peter Bottomley.
First of all, I don't know when landing cards came in, and if someone arrived on the Empire Windrush in 1948, or on a ship in the next 15, 20 years, first of all, were the landing cards? I don't think there were. Secondly, if they were British, would they have been asked to fill in a landing card even if they arrived by air? I think the answer is no. When I campaigned for Krishna Maharaj, who spent 31 years wrongly in jail in Florida, he is British. Some might say he was born in Trinidad, but he was. but being born in Trinidad when he was born, you were British. And if you're British, you don't get to fill in the landing cards, which is my point about how we allow these distractions to take away from the common sense point. What on earth are we doing thinking that the landing cards will solve this problem? Even the manifests don't solve the nationality problem. And we do know that when people were coming here, especially from the Caribbean, after the war, they were British until our law started making things rather different. But we're not talking about that generation. We're talking about the generation who are of the Sam Kings and the Arthur Torringtons and the like, who also wrote about the contribution that people from the Caribbean were making before 1948, as well as during 1948 and afterwards. So I think the only contribution I really want to make to this debate is, first of all, for those who actually want to know where targets came from, they weren't new in 2010, they weren't new in 2015, they're well discussed in the Will Somerville book, Immigration Under New Labour, and I've no doubt they were probably there before New Labour as well. What we should be saying is, how can we say to those who are undocumented British nationals, British subjects, British citizens, how soon and how easily can we give you the documents and make sure that you have what you have? We aren't talking about someone who says, I'm 17 when actually they're 23 and they've sadly had to come across the Mediterranean from Syria or from some other country in the last 2 or 3 years. We're talking about people who, just looking at them, you can tell they've been around for almost as long as I have, or as long as my children have, which is still quite some time, and say, let's get you documented in the easiest, fastest, simplest, fairest way that's possible. And I say to those who are advising ministers, whether inside a government department or outside, always say to a minister, is this fair? Is it right? Will it work? And this man, my brother here, and I could probably solve 3/4 of this if we sat together for 3/4 of an hour and take away the anxiety, and we could apologise for the distress that's wrongly been caused to too many for too long. But the fact is, common sense normally works. Let's apply it.
Emma Reynolds.
Thank you, Mr. Robertson. I will start by thanking Patrick Vernon, originally from Wolverhampton, all the best people are, for setting up this petition, and a huge thank you to the 178,000 people who have signed it. I want to thank my right honourable friend, the member for Tottenham, for his powerful advocacy and his incredible work and determination to seek justice for the Windrush generation. Finally, I want to add my thanks to those of my colleagues, to all of those British people of the Windrush generation, whether they have the documents to say that they are British or not, they are British, for coming here in the post-war period and helping to rebuild Britain. My right honourable friend for Tottenham was right to say that the way in which they have been treated is a national disgrace. I want to talk specifically about my constituent Paulette Wilson, one of the Windrush generation, who has been treated by this government in the most appalling and inhumane manner. We know that the Home Secretary resigned last night, but in my view, this isn't the end of the matter. The government still has serious questions to answer about the way Paulette and others have been treated. And also, they have questions to answer about how we avoid this happening in the future, both to the Windrush generation and other Commonwealth citizens, but also to EU citizens way into the future. I still think that the Prime Minister has serious questions to answer about a raft of policies that she introduced as Home Secretary to create a hostile environment and to create the conditions for this awful scandal. So not only do we have to deal with tackling the injustice of the way that the Windrush generation has been treated, but we have to look at those policies too, and I think the government needs to change some of those policies. My constituent Paulette Wilson came to the UK from Jamaica in 1968 at the age of 10. She's worked in the UK all of her life. She's never left the country. She's even worked here in Parliament, serving and waiting on MPs in Commons restaurants. She received a letter from the Home Office out of the blue in August 2015, and to her dismay, they accused her of having no evidence to be here legally and no evidence of her entry into the UK. She started having to report to the Immigration Centre in Solihull. 2 years later, despite the fact she had gathered substantial evidence of her 50 years in the UK, including 34 years of paying national insurance and the fact she has a grown-up daughter and a granddaughter, she was detained during one of her visits to the immigration centre. She spent a week in Yarlswood, fearful of what was going to happen next. She became even more scared when she was taken to the detention centre at Heathrow. Let's just imagine for a minute what it was like for her. Just imagine that you were in her shoes. You have lived and worked in the UK for 50 years, you've raised a family, you feel and you are British. You haven't left the UK in all of this time, and you suddenly find yourself in a detention centre at Heathrow Airport being told you are going to be put on a flight to Jamaica. She could hear planes taking off, and she really thought she was going to be put on a plane. I intervened, and so did the Refugee and Migrant Centre in Wolverhampton, and her family reluctantly, because they are a private family, contacted the media. Paulette was released at the 11th hour. I want to thank the Refugee and Migrant Centre and the journalist Amelia Gentleman for helping Paulette and her family. But this experience has stayed with Paulette. In the weeks after she was detained, she talked about struggling to eat and to sleep. Despite repeated demands for an explanation as to why she was detained, we still don't know why she was detained at Yarlswood and then sent to the detention centre. And I would like to ask the Immigration Minister a number of questions. She may not be able to answer them today, but I would like some clarification on this. Why were we never given an explanation as to why Paulette was detained? Why didn't the Home Office consider 34 years of national insurance contributions? Why didn't they check with the Department for Work and Pensions? The family provided other evidence of her decades of living in the UK. Why was that disregarded and disbelieved? The Prime Minister was in Wolverhampton last week and apologised to Paulette through the Express and Star, which is welcome. But why hasn't the Prime Minister or any other government minister apologised to Paulette directly? More broadly, why did it take an initial refusal by Downing Street to meet the Commonwealth heads of state and government on this very issue? And why did it take the action of my right honourable friend, the member for Tottenham, and the many, many articles written by Amelia Gentleman for this national scandal to come to light? I have known about this for months. Other members have known about this for years. I don't understand why it has taken so long for us to realise that there was a severe and cruel injustice being meted out to these people by this government. In January this year, I asked the government a written parliamentary question. How many Commonwealth citizens legally resident in the UK have been detained and deported, and would the government apologise in those cases? The Immigration Minister, and she is here with us today, and I welcome that, said it would be too costly to give these numbers. But the government has since committed to doing this, and I would like to ask her when we can expect to have those numbers. Will the Minister and the new Home Secretary undertake to write to those who have been mistreated to give them an apology? When can we expect the compensation scheme to be in place? And will the government consider putting in place legal aid for those who are willing to come forward? Now, I've been very troubled by a briefing that I received, and every other member will have had the same briefing, from the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, because the departing Home Secretary said in the House recently that she could guarantee that there will be no future enforcement action against the Windrush generation if they make themselves known to the new task force. But in the briefing document I have, it says, and I quote, "The head of the task force himself has told us on the telephone that referrals to immigration enforcement would be made on a case-by-case basis." I'd like the Minister to clarify this, because it is still not clear what the government are expecting from people who come forward, who are members of this generation, in terms of documentation. And you cannot blame them for being fearful of coming forward, given what has happened to my constituent and many others. The focus of the last few days, and particularly yesterday evening, was what the departing Home Secretary knew and what she didn't know about local regional targets and whether she misled, knowingly or not, Parliament. She said that she didn't knowingly mislead Parliament. But I think this is, in a way now, an irrelevance. What I want to know is why there are regional targets for removal. Why is the government treating people as numbers, not human beings? And what is going to be done about these targets? Are the government going to get rid of them? I think it's a terrible irony that the government destroys landing cards and then accuses my constituents and others of not having evidence of their entry in the UK. I think it's a terrible irony that the government collects taxes and national insurance contributions, but disbelieves individuals when they come up with that evidence. I don't know why the government can't look for themselves. I think it's a terrible irony that the departing Home Secretary is apparently not on top of her paperwork, but the government accuses my constituent and of others of not having their paperwork in order to prove their status. The Home Office seems to systematically distrust and disbelieve people. And now it is asking the Windrush generation, who perhaps don't have the paperwork they need, to trust and believe that the government will believe them. And it's not a surprise that that generation still feel betrayed and still feel distrustful of the government. So I think the government needs to get a grip on this situation very quickly. They still need to explain what went wrong, why it took so long for this scandal to come to light. I would like personal apologies to everybody, including my constituent, who have been mistreated, and the compensation scheme needs to be dealt with properly and urgently. But broadly, and on top of all of that, and that is important, I think the government needs to look at its policy. They need to get rid of the removal targets and start treating people as human beings, not numbers.
Here.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Robertson, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And may I begin by reiterating the thanks to the campaigner, Patrick Vernon, for pulling together this and launching the petition, and also to my right honourable friends, the member for Tottenham and the member for Hackney North and Stoke Newington, for their work in Parliament on challenging the government's handling of the Windrush scandal. They speak with great power and authenticity. I'd also like to put on record how proud I am that my constituency secured the third highest number of signatories to this petition, and wanted to briefly quote the writer Carol Phillips, who was born in Leeds and writes very movingly on a number of topics, including the Windrush generation. And in his text, Higher Ground, he said, "I'm grateful and would thank the gods that I have finally mastered this art of forgetting, of murdering the memory." I think there he's probably talking about slavery and a number of other things, but there is a sense in which it's very relevant to this debate. And I would challenge us as a parliament that we do not murder the memory of the Commonwealth, and in particular of the Windrush generation. I wanted briefly to mention a couple of cases in my constituency, and I have permission from my constituents to mention those. I have a constituent, a woman who came to the UK in 1964 as a one-year-old child with her parents, and her representatives were eventually able to persuade the Home Office via medical records that she had been here continuously since before the 1st of January 1973 and was settled at that time and therefore still has indefinite leave to remain. However, the Passport Office have not accepted this in relation to her grandchild and are refusing to issue the grandchild a passport. That's because they say that the grandchild's mother, who has lived in the UK continually since her birth in the 1980s, is not a British citizen. They refuse to accept that grandmother had indefinite leave to remain when her daughter was born, and therefore she's not a British citizen. And so her daughter is not either. the Passport Office are now also contemplating withdrawing this constituent's British passport. So I'd be very grateful if the Minister, perhaps not today, but perhaps in writing, if I could raise that case with her, with the specificity of the grandchildren. I mean, I recall, as a Commonwealth citizen myself, that in the old days, firstly, that my grandmother always referred to the UK as the mother country, and secondly, that we used to travel on our parents' passports. So it's very easy to see how these sorts of confusions arose. And I think what we're all saying in today's debate is that we need to give people the benefit of the doubt. And the wonderful story of the member for Wolverhampton's, just the whole story is so moving in all of its complexity. I wonder briefly as well whether the Minister would just touch on, even though it's quite strictly not about other Commonwealth citizens, but whether she would just touch on those who are from Cyprus and other areas, just because I think what's happened now due to the publicity is that so many others are starting to ask questions. And I had, for example, a woman well into her 70s who came to the UK from Cyprus and who's now having to do a quiz, a citizenship quiz. And she's worked as a seamstress in this country in North London for years and years, and it seems to be such an insult to ask her when her daughter is representing us on the London Borough of Haringey and all sorts. It just seems to me to be almost an insult to ask her to have to do a citizenship quiz at her advanced age. I really hope that this can be an example, not just to bring more transparency to the way that people are dealt with, but also all those others who are affected. On Friday, I had another woman in tears. Her job at another local authority has been outsourced to a particular company, and that large company has asked her to go off and do a biometric test at the Home Office, which, of course, she went off to do, and she doesn't qualify for all these other thresholds that she can't cross, and yet she showed me the stamp in her passport, been in the UK since 1970, indefinite leave to remain. Why would she necessarily think, with all the expense that the citizenship process entails, that she would have to then claim citizenship? And I think what upset her was less the paperwork, because I think slowly we can resolve that with the excellent caseworkers that so many of us as MPs have, and my own included. But I feel that she was really doubting that for all these years she's felt part of the furniture and part of us, and yet she felt that she was other or outside or different, and a strong sense of not belonging, and that was what had upset her. And we had a hug, and I hope that we can sort that out, but I'm not sure that all MPs can just provide tea and sympathy. It does come down to a policy response which needs to be more transparent, which needs to have equality at its heart, because there's just not enough MPs and hugs and cups of tea to go around. We need equality, and we need genuine transparency in our system. To conclude, Mr Robertson, I welcome the fact that the Home Secretary has paid. The outgoing Home Secretary has paid with her career, her political career, for this. And I think the trail probably leads higher than her. And once again, we will not give up, because I think we have to continue to ask questions, and we've had a wonderful example from the member of Tottenham and from others who have just continued to hammer away at this question and to continue to keep the flame alive of equality and of not murdering our history. And I do hope that the new Home Secretary, who says it could have been my mum, could have been my dad, it could have been my uncle, it could have been me, as the member for Aldershot quoted. And I would hope, I always try and end my debates with a sense of hope, that with a new Home Secretary, with his personal experience, that we can continue to work together to solve this, to have a genuinely equal society, and one where we are all the same, genuinely, under this sky. Thank you. Thank you, Mr Robertson.
Stuart MacDonald.
Mr Robertson, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and can I too thank the petitioner and the signatories for bringing this debate before the House today, the Petitions Committee for scheduling the debate, and the Honourable Member for St Austell and Newquay for very ably introducing it. We've had lots of very powerful and thoughtful speeches. The arrival of 492 passengers on board the Empire Windrush at Tilbury Docks in June 1948 was indeed a pivotal and iconic moment in British history. The pictures and TV footage of the time that you can still see on the internet show people's faces brimming with optimism. They were legally full citizens of Britain for the first time thanks to the British Nationality Act of 1948, a piece of legislation aimed at preserving a united Commonwealth. But despite a labour shortage at the time, estimated in one government survey at standing between 600,000 and 1.3 million people, it's fair to say, as my honourable friend has pointed out, that the arrival of the first of the Windrush generation was initially neither welcome nor encouraged. An emergency meeting of the Cabinet Economic Policy Committee was called to discuss the situation, and urgent reports sought as to who the ringleaders of this so-called incursion were. The Minister of Labour required to reassure MPs that no encouragement will be given to others to follow their example. But despite this less than enthusiastic initial welcome, as many honourable members have pointed out, most especially the honourable member for Tottenham, this generation would go on to make a massive contribution to rebuilding the country after the war, enriching it both economically and culturally. If there is one tiny silver lining in this disastrous episode, it is that it has cast a light once again on their extraordinary role in our history, and I join other honourable members in paying tribute to it and thanking them for it. But fast forward 7 decades, Mr Robertson, that tiny silver lining will be of scant comfort to those who have been treated so appallingly by the Home Office. And yet the appalling episode can and should now be seen not just as a predictable, but almost an inevitable consequence of UK government migration policy. It's not simply a matter of an administrative cock-up. The truth is that the Home Office and the Prime Minister entirely neglected these Commonwealth citizens when she went about ramping up the hostile environment. Demanding checks on status at every turn, it seems little thought was given as to how it would be often close to impossible for many Windrush children and others to prove their legal situation. So over time, they were dismissed from jobs they had done for years, they struggled to access NHS treatment and services, and they even faced detention and removal, as we've heard from honourable members today. Some who went abroad were not allowed to return. The Home Office knew this sort of scandal could happen. It was not just a matter of MPs bringing individual cases. The Home Office was warned by NGOs, including the outstanding Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. Concerns were raised by the High Commissioners representing Caribbean countries. And later, Mr Robertson, its own Equality Impact Assessment for the 2016 Immigration Act flagged up precisely what would happen. It is almost as if the implications for the Windrush generation were seen as little more than unfortunate, but not something that required any action, never mind the urgent action that was desperately needed. So quite rightly, there is widespread public outcry, as the Honourable Member for West Ham has described. Parliament is clearly angry, and it is quite right to be angry, and members have rightly raised a number of important questions. Given that confidence in the Home Office has been utterly shattered, surely the Government must now provide legal aid for those who believe they may require to contact the Home Office helpline. Otherwise, many will simply not do it. So can the Immigration Minister agree just to go back and discuss with the Justice Department the absolute necessity of provision of legal aid? Can we have an assurance that no one from the Windrush generation is in detention or being asked to report? And as the Honourable Lady for Wolverhampton North East has asked, can we make absolutely clear that information will not be passed on from the hotline to be used in enforcement action? How broad is the Home Office search for others that have been wrongly detained and removed or not allowed re-entry? And what standard of proof precisely is the Home Office requiring to prove citizenship or the right to settled status here? What rights will there be to challenge negative decisions from the Home Office, and what will the compensation scheme look like? And can we have an absolute assurance that the Home Office staff are not under pressure to remove or deport individuals through a target that incentivises ignoring or not exploring possible rights to be in this country? All of these questions require an answer. But as a number of honourable members have been quick to do and have been quite right to do, we have to see this in the broader context as well, Mr Robertson. Because in a sense, this scandal is just the tip of the iceberg. The Windrush children are just one of several groups of utterly innocent people treated almost as if expendable, while the Prime Minister relentlessly pursues her now widely ridiculed and utterly bogus net migration target. Her policies mean that tens of thousands of children across the UK are separated from one parent living abroad, and even more couples are kept apart by some of the most draconianly restrictive family migration rules in the world. The checks that she has imposed on landlords in England have pushed landlords and landladies into the role of immigration officers, with the result that fear of getting it wrong has driven discrimination against prospective tenants who look foreign or have a foreign-sounding name. And despite the Home Office being regularly criticised for poor decision-making, she has removed in-country rights of appeal, meaning folk have to leave their jobs and families for months on end, sometimes longer, to somehow try and overturn those decisions from abroad. Thousands of innocent students have been arrested and deported without even getting to see the evidence that the Home Office used to decide their guilt, never mind having the chance to challenge it in a tribunal. And at one and the same time, the Home Office has commissioned a review of the complexity of the immigration rules, yet insists that they're not complex enough to justify legal aid in England and Wales. Fees for applications for citizenship and passports have soared. The list of injustices goes on and on. 2 weeks ago, the then Home Secretary said she was concerned that the Home Office has become too concerned with policy and strategy and sometimes loses sight of the individual. She was right, Mr Robertson, but that is the fault of ministers, including the Prime Minister, who have created policies and strategies that forget the individuals and families whose lives are being destroyed. It is the computer says no approach that the Honourable Member for North Dorset described very aptly. And all the while, there is not a shred of evidence that any of this has achieved anything other than division and messed up lives. Since the 2014 Act, voluntary returns have actually gone down. The evidence that the Home Affairs Select Committee actually receives suggests that this hostile environment actually sometimes makes it harder to enforce immigration rules rather than easier by driving folk away into the black private rented market, into the black employment market as well. And it also has to be pointed out, Mr Robertson, that there's been some talk today about illegal migrants as if one body of very wicked and evil people that we should all celebrate the removal. But these include husbands and wives unable to secure status because of the very strict immigration rules that I described earlier. I read today about somebody who served in Afghanistan, an Afghan national who worked alongside our forces in that country, and the Home Office is trying to remove him. He's an illegal migrant as well. What about lots of children who didn't understand, never mind couldn't even afford to regularise their status there? That's something I'll come back to in just a moment. What we need before we can go around talking about hostile environment is actually a decision which gets a system which gets decisions right and commands public confidence, has appropriate oversight and systems of appeal, and has a clear and simple way to determine who is here lawfully and who is not. None of that remotely exists at the moment, so this hostile environment must be reined in urgently. So it's now essential that going forward, MPs across the House start standing up against a hostile environment and finally put the notorious net migration target out of its miserable existence. The Honourable Member for Worthing East rightly asked about what can be done looking forward. An early test for Parliament will be the Data Protection Bill and the Home Office attempt to help itself to a massive immigration exemption. There is absolutely no doubt that stripping people of the right to know what data the Home Office has about them and to challenge inaccuracies will create further burning injustices. And as the Honourable Member for Wolverhampton North East pointed out, we need to prevent a repeat of the Windrush fiasco. So we need to ask what work has been done to identify other groups who may be at risk, whether Commonwealth citizens or otherwise. And let me suggest just two, Mr Robertson. Firstly, there are tens of thousands of children either born here in the UK or who have lived most of their lives here but who are undocumented. At the same time, they are entitled by law to British citizenship if they register. But if they cannot register and become citizens, they will face exactly the same issues as the Windrush generation. In those circumstances, I cannot see how the Home Office can justify charging over £1,000 for the privilege of registration. These are children entitled to British citizenship. They should not be charged to exercise their rights in this country any more than the Windrush generation should, and that must be put right immediately. Most obviously and urgently, as my honourable friend for Edinburgh North and Leith has said, there are 3 million and more EU nationals that we must look after. We must be urgently updated by the Government regarding progress in establishing its system for seeking settled status. But regardless of how successful that system eventually proves to be, it is very hard to see how we can avoid a situation where tens and probably hundreds of thousands of them will end any grace period without having successfully navigated the system to secure a document to prove that status. And if that happens, this will be Windrush on an even more desperate scale. These, Mr Robertson, are the immediate priorities. If Parliament is seriously angry about the hostile environment, it will then get down to the business of a root and branch review of the 2014 and 2016 Immigration Acts, and instead start putting in place a system that properly respects people and their human rights and the rule of law. Because the one we have just now too often fails to do so. Windrush is an awful and an extreme example of it, but it's far from the only one.
So calm.
Mr. Chairman, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I, too, have a Commonwealth heritage and understand and support every word said by my honourable friend for Tottenham. And I also want to thank him for his excellent and impressive work against this injustice. I also want to thank the petitioner and the 178,000 who have signed this petition. I think the Prime Minister has tried to hide behind the former Home Secretary. In reality, she was the architect of these terrible policies and their awful consequences. The former Home Secretary simply carried on her work. News coverage of the last few days has been wall-to-wall on the politics of Amber Rudd's resignation and Sajid Javid's appointment as Home Secretary. The petition allows us to recenter the debate on the most important issue here, the Home Office's appalling treatment of the Windrush generation. These are British citizens who have been made homeless, denied health care, lost their jobs, detained, and potentially deported. Thanks to The Guardian, a number of cases are now well known. We have further heard many cases today in this debate. We heard about Paul Wilson, and there's another case I want to share here, the Sarah O'Connor, who arrived at the age of 6 and worked in a computer shop from 16 until last October. She lost that job when the benefit agencies challenged her immigration status. Other employers refused to hire her when they realized she had no passport. Only when her case got national media attention last month did the Home Office promise to waive her fees for a biometric card application. As we know, there are many, many more cases like this. At a Windrush meeting in my own constituency, I came across similar heartbreaking cases. The scandal is also wider than the government wants to admit. It includes those who came from many other Commonwealth countries, including India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and many African countries and others. The Migration Observatory estimates there are 57,000 such UK citizens from the Commonwealth who are directly affected. It also includes children who were brought here after 1973 by parents who arrived here before then. Immigrants who are starting out in a new country can't always afford to bring their children with them. Although they didn't arrive in the UK before 1973, they are clearly part of the Windrush generation. How did this scandal came about? 2 words: hostile environment. This was a policy that was supposed to apply to illegal immigrants, but was predicted, it has affected anyone suspected of being an illegal immigrant. This is exactly what has happened to the Windrush generation. It was the Tory-led government that removed protection in 2014 for Commonwealth citizens who had arrived in this country before 1973. As Home Secretary, the Prime Minister also brought in the 2016 Act, which obliges landlords, employers, the NHS, and Benefits Office to demand written proof of nationality, which many people do not possess. The government knew the early arrivals from the Commonwealth, British citizens, did not possess these proofs, but they went ahead anyway. We have had many questions from members in this debate. What needs to happen now? We need answers. how many of the Windrush generations have been deported or detained? How many voluntarily left under the threat of deportation? How many have been refused re-entry after traveling abroad? Will the victims be fully compensated for all costs, all loss of incomes and services and distress? Will the helpline report cases for deportation enforcement? Will they believe people are here illegally? Where they believe people are here illegally? Did the Home Office issue advice to immigration tribunals and judges of the changes in the 2014 Immigration Act, which removed protections for Commonwealth citizens? The government has attempted to introduce red herrings in the debate. Illegal immigration is opposed on all sides. Labour is in favour of deporting illegal immigrants. We have pledged 500 extra border forces guards to tackle this problem. But the Commonwealth citizens who came here legally are still legal. It is this government's policy which have effectively threatened them as illegal. It is this scandal that government has created, and it should end. Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Robertson, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I would also like to extend my thanks to the Honourable Member for St Austell and Newquay and Honourable and Right Honourable members from across the House who've participated in this debate, who have spoken with passion, with knowledge and indeed with determination. As we can see very clearly, there is significant public interest, and rightly so, in today's debate, and I thank members of the public who have also attended, as well as all those nearly 200,000 people who added their name to the petition. Obviously, the scheduling of today's debate came prior to the urgent question, and I am probably at somewhat of a disadvantage to those members who were certainly able to be in the chamber for some of the urgent question earlier on. But I think we can be very clear from the message that the new Secretary of State conveyed that he is absolutely personally invested in this issue. Let us be in absolutely no doubt about the debt of gratitude that this country owes to the Windrush generation. As my honourable friend described in his opening, those who were invited to come to the United Kingdom immediately after the Second World War and in the decades that followed to help us build modern Britain. The new Home Secretary, as I said, was on his feet in the chamber when this debate began. He has rightly made it his clear priority to address Windrush, building on the work of his predecessor, my right honourable friend, the member for Hastings and Rye, who showed commitment to address this issue. It was a pleasure to work with her in the Home Office, and I look forward to supporting the new Home Secretary in continuing this vital work. I would like to do justice to the comments, the questions, and the individual cases that members have raised this afternoon. They are important. And I start, interestingly, many members will have noticed that I took copious notes throughout the debate, and I start somewhat shamedly with the Right Honourable Member for Tottenham, about whose contribution I have written very little indeed. And that is because I preferred to listen to his passion, to his determination to convey to me, to members, to the public, to the government, how strongly he feels that we must right this wrong, and we are determined to do that. My honourable friend from Cheltenham, who's not in his place, I'd like to congratulate his tone and the tone of all members who have contributed, because there has been real consideration of the issue, real determination to convey the message to me as powerfully as possible. And I would like to start by saying, of course I feel shame, and of course I am deeply, deeply sorry. The Honourable Member for Mitcham and Morden raised 3 cases, and she highlighted the very real and personal stories, which were similar to the personal stories I heard over this weekend when I was in both Croydon and in Sheffield with those caseworkers who are on the front line doing their best to help people through this process. I have to say I was very impressed with the determination of those caseworkers to be as sympathetic, as understanding, and to talk people through the process as gently as they possibly could, whilst at the same time enabling people to give their stories, to provide a picture of their life in the UK and help them through a process with which we should have been helping them much, much earlier. You cannot fail to be moved when confronted with the individual stories, to be ashamed, but as a result, to be determined to get this wrong righted, to sort the cases out, and to make sure that the legal status is confirmed. The Honourable Lady from Mitcham and Morden mentioned 3 cases, and we have done a very, very rapid trawl of those appointments that are already scheduled, and I believe one of those cases will be hopefully resolved tomorrow. But it is, of course, important, and I want to give a very strong message, but it is important that we as members convey to our constituents, to the public at large, that this is a process which is designed to be constructive, to help. I think when I first spoke on this issue, I tried to impress that we needed to have confidence built in this system so that people would have the courage to come forward. And in many ways, I think absolutely the best advocates are those people who have been for their interviews, who have had their status confirmed and have been willing to speak to the media to confirm that that has happened. They undoubtedly are the strongest advocates for it. My honourable friend, the member for North Dorset, spoke of the melting pot of Cardiff. Of course, I represent part of the city of Southampton, an area that too has a very large and considerable port, and I was very fortunate last Thursday night to go and meet one of my constituents, albeit in the road that is bisected on the edge of the constituency, a gentleman called Don John, who for many decades has been a leader of the Caribbean community in Southampton. And I discussed with him, knowing very well that this weekend the Honourable Member for Bristol West was holding an event in her constituency, attended by Home Office officials, in order to give confidence to those from Bristol who might be affected, that the Home Office is there to help. And I said to Don on Thursday night, look, let's see how the event in Bristol goes, but this is absolutely what I can do as a local member is make sure that people in Southampton have the opportunity to have an event. I will make sure that there are Home Office officials there. And I would say that to all members. Where there is a significant community who they think will be affected, then let's do this. Let's reach out to communities. Let's not be a call centre and just a reception centre in the various places that we have up and down the country, but actually let's make a real effort to go to communities, to make sure that events take place in places where they are comfortable. Because I am the first to acknowledge that there can be barriers to coming and making contact with the Home Office, and they are barriers which I am absolutely determined, working with my right honourable friend, the new Home Secretary, to beat down, because those barriers should not be there. Of course I'll give way.
Can I say to her that I am genuinely delighted to hear what she has to say, and I do think that she is a very competent minister, so I'm grateful to her. But can I also say to her that there's an issue of trust, and I genuinely don't see my communities beating their way to her door because that trust has been so badly damaged.
The Honourable Lady is absolutely right to talk about trust. And that is why I am emphasising and re-emphasising, and I take on the chin her comment, because we have to rebuild that trust. We have a duty to rebuild that trust, and I'm determined that we must do so. And we must do so through demonstration, through action, through an assurance from me and those working on the task force. No case will be passed to immigration enforcement. When somebody contacts that helpline, we have absolutely undertaken that none of those details will be passed on to immigration enforcement. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
The Minister will recognise that the government still says that there is a burden, although it's lowered the burden of proof. If there were Windrush generation people who contacted the line, or indeed Commonwealth people who contacted the Home Office, and they did not meet that burden, and so they did not get their status, would they be subject to enforcement? Because that fear is very real.
Minister. I thank the right honourable gentleman for that question, because it is an important question, and I give that assurance. People may well come forward who do not have the proof, who cannot produce proof. And it is absolutely imperative, if we are to build trust, that we say, no, we will not pass those details to immigration enforcement. Because actually the message has to be, we want, and this is exactly what I saw on Saturday, we want to be able to help people to build their own story. We want to be able to use whatever disparate pieces of information they may have. And a gentleman came on Saturday morning to Croydon, and he could produce his city and guilds, I believe it was in horticulture, but that was pretty much the only evidence that he had of having been at school, where he'd been at school, where he'd secured one certificate. And we have to listen to people. We have to use our own records. And I think that's a really important, certainly, I will give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. And does she have a view about the legal aid question? Because I think in the old days we all had legal aid centres people can go to, but they simply do not exist in communities in the way that they did due to reductions by the government. Sorry. Could she comment on that possibility around legal aid?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady for that question. I'm slightly concerned that there is an outbreak of coughing going on in the debate, and maybe the atmosphere... It's freezing. The Honourable Lady is right. It's absolutely freezing, and I've been shaking throughout this, and maybe that's not just about the temperature. So I think that there is an interesting question, and we are working with the Justice Department already on a review into legal aid, but I don't want people to have to use lawyers for this. I want them to be able to go through an easy process, and I get the message. I get the message from the Honourable Lady for West Ham, that we have to build trust, and I am determined to do so. I will take the intervention, but can I just finish on this point? Because actually, I don't want people to have to incur more stress, more cost, and we will reimburse them for legal costs already as part of the compensation scheme, and I'm going to come on to address the issue of the compensation scheme. But I think there is an important aspect here. We are determined to make this easy. We are determined to have the most senior, the most able caseworkers who we are trying to empower through a change of culture in the Home Office to take decisions. Not the computer says no attitude, which my honourable friend and many others have referred to, but more a position of computer says yes, but actually better than computer, human says yes. And that's a real change. And I give way to the Honourable Lady in that.
Thank you. I'm one of the second generations of Windrush. My parents came in 1954. Now, what we're talking about, and I really don't understand why people have to prove that they live in a country when they, A, have children of age 30 and more, or if not older, B, they've probably got grandkids as well. So why are we talking about having to prove? Why can't we just give them a blanket exception? I really don't understand. If somebody's in a country from 1948 onwards to 1974, is that's what you're saying, which is about 45 years, isn't it? Why you're talking about having to prove that they're living in this country?
So I think there's a significant and important question about deemed leave and about processes in 1973 which did not give people a legal document which demonstrated their status. And that is the failing that we're having to put right now. And I do think it is important because there may well be people out there who don't come forward. And we have to work to give people confidence, but also to give them an important document that enables them to go on and get their British citizenship, all at no cost. But it's really, because I do not want anyone to fall foul of this going forward. So actually, if we just say, well, OK, we grant deemed leave again, we may find ourselves in this situation. And that's why, and many members have mentioned this today, the difference with EU settled status. And this is a really important and difficult point. And since I came into this job, actually, a great deal of my time and energy has been taken up with making sure that the settled status scheme, which we will be opening later this year, is going to work. And it matters to me that it works digitally and easily, and rather than the computer says no mentality, we have a default position where if you are here, the computer will say yes. And the Honourable Lady opposite asked a question about whether the app will work on iPhone. So we have been working for many, many months. It works on an Android phone, but Apple as yet have not released the update that would enable it to work on iPhones. Now, I absolutely recognise that that is a problem. I would encourage all members and Right Honourable and Honourable members to talk about this, because actually I can't force Apple to participate. I wish I could, but I can't. But I think it is really important that we make the process for those EU citizens who, just like the Windrush generation, many of whom have been here for years, that we make the process for them simple, straightforward and digital. And I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the Minister for giving way. And I also thank you for actually making this clarification that there will be no case so will be passed on for enforcement. What I would like you to comment on is we've seen that it's not simply a question of enforcement. There are people suffering from cancer and dying. It's the health treatment. There are people who are becoming homeless. There are people who are losing jobs. So what will you be doing with that?
I thank the honourable gentleman for the question. And it is absolutely right to say that the task force at present are prioritising appointments for those who are in vulnerable positions, so those who are either out of employment or at risk of falling out of employment, for those with health conditions, for those with problems with tenancies. Because actually we have a significant group of people that we must work with, but it is right to prioritise people on basis of need. But actually we are working really hard, and it was great to see those callbacks going on in Sheffield, the appointments being made, people having the conversations. And my right honourable friend, the former Home Secretary, made it very clear that when it comes to compensation, that we will compensate people for loss. But I think it is right that we get the compensation scheme right from the outset. And there have been some interesting points raised here this afternoon about what should be included, and many of them may seem really self-evident and straightforward, and it should be about legal costs and people who have lost employment and lost housing, etc. But there may also be other aspects, and I think a number of people have talked about counselling, about the stress and trauma, and I think it is important that we have an independent person who is going to enable and empower us to get it right from the outset. So it will take a little bit of time, but I do think it is important that we have somebody independent of the Home Office who will be able to engender trust. Sorry, there's two of... I'll take an intervention from the honourable gentleman, though he's not been here long.
Can I thank the honourable lady for giving way, and also thank her for the very welcome remedial measures that she's outlining, which could help to deal with the outcomes. But doesn't she recognise that this comes from deep systemic problems and cultural problems inside the Home Office? An utter refusal when members of Parliament have been raising cases, pointing out the flaws in the argument, an utter refusal then to reconsider. It's not just about the computer says yes or the person at the initial line saying yes. It is a failure of management to actually then remedy that. That's why we're having to get into compensation and task forces and everything else. But those deep problems will still be in the Home Office. What's she going to do about it?
And unfortunately, the honourable gentleman has raised an intervention which takes me away from some of the contributions that have been made today and to the somewhat, I don't know how to describe it, drier technical detail provided for me by officials. I'm happy to move on to that, but I would like to first just respond to those points that members who have been here for the whole debate have made. I think there are some important points that I've addressed about settled status for EU citizens and the responsibility of getting that right. But I would also like to highlight the history lesson and information provided by my honourable friend, the member for Worthing West. He absolutely painted a picture of how we, as government, can use evidence already at our disposal. And I think that's really important, that the data sharing that we can do, whether it be with the DVLA, whether it be with the DOH, DWP, HMRC, the list is long. But that's exactly what the task force is doing at the moment, and trying to lift the burden from individuals and place it upon ourselves so that we provide the information and make sure that we get it right. The Honourable Lady from Wolverhampton North East started by saying thank you. And she's absolutely right to do so, to thank all of those from the Windrush generation who have contributed so much. But she raised some difficult and important questions for me about how we stop this happening again. And she is absolutely right to do so. We have to stop it from happening again. We have to make sure that the same cannot happen to future cohorts. And my honourable friend from Aldershot mentioned the Gurkhas, the Nepalese community that are so numerous in their base in Hampshire. And we have to be the whole while mindful that there may well be other communities who would be impacted. And of course, uppermost in my mind, as I've indicated time and again, are those from the European Union who are already here, and that is a truly enormous number of people, 3.3 million, and I do not underestimate the scale of that task. She raised how we could right the wrong that had been done to her constituent, Paulette Wilson. Mrs. Wilson absolutely deserves a personal apology. I am not sure that me saying sorry today is adequate, and if the Honourable Lady would like it, then I'm very happy to meet Mrs. Wilson, because hers was a case which every one of us in this place was obviously struck by the severe and cruel injustice that was done to her. There have been some questions raised by the Honourable Lady and indeed the opposition spokesman about how many people have been affected, how many have been detained, how many may have been subject to letters asking them to leave the country on a voluntary basis or indeed potentially even removed. We are trawling through the Home Office computer system, SIDS, that goes back to 2002, very carefully scrutinising cases using, as one might expect, both date of birth and nationality information to verify that. I do not wish to get into numbers until I can be confident that they are correct. I think we have an absolute duty to make sure that we get that right. To date, we have not found any single individual that has been removed from the country wrongly. However, I wish to make sure that we get it right. And everybody is leaping to their feet. And I will take a final intervention from the Honourable Gentleman, but I do think I have to crack on a bit.
There is an important group of people who may not have been removed, but they are watching and listening to this debate and communicating with their families in this country. And that group of people are people who went back to the Caribbean, most often to attend a funeral, and were not allowed to come back into the country. It's very important that those people have access to this hotline, that those people have access to compensation. Many of them lost their jobs and are still there, and those people are properly tracked and attended to.
And the Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right to point them out. And I'm very conscious. Can I just conclude the point first before more people jump in? I think he's right to point it out. And we absolutely, as the former Home Secretary said last week, we will facilitate those people coming home if they wish to. And of course, for those who have settled back in their country of origin or potentially indeed elsewhere, we have to make sure, should they wish to come here on a visit, that those visas are available to them, because that is crucially important. If they wish to come back on a visit visa or to stay or to relocate here permanently, but it's important that we make sure that we enable that to happen for them. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm grateful. It may be possible that the Minister wants to write to the Right Honourable Gentleman afterwards. I think that one of the useful suggestions officials may want to consider and advise ministers on, not today but in time, is to check with the airlines, because often these people have come with a valid ticket to the airline desk and been refused entry to the airline because they might be refused entry to the country. I think the airlines will almost certainly have a record, and that would be useful information.
I thank my honourable friend for that point. And of course, that was a point that I also made to officials, that I was very concerned that people might be turned away at an airline desk. And we absolutely must not let that happen. But equally, Border Force in the UK, should people arrive here, have to understand that this is a generation of people to whom we owe a duty to get it right from this point forward. We cannot allow these dreadful situations to arise again. There's
on the issue of trust, Minister, on the issue of trust, my constituents are still concerned that deportations are continuing despite the fact that we are having these debates and despite the reassurances from yourself, from the Home Secretary, and indeed the Prime Minister. In fact, one of my constituents has contacted me, Azita, and she's asked about flight PVT 070, which she tells me is going to Jamaica with people on board who are about to be deported. I'd be grateful to see that shake of the head put into words on the record. Thank you.
I thank the Honourable Lady for that. Absolutely not. It is not. And we are looking very closely at all of our enforcement practices to make sure that nobody can be impacted in this way, and that is crucially important. I hope honourable members won't object, but there are some important matters that I must get on the record, and I intend to do so. So I apologise if I, at this point, move on somewhat. I'm very clear that there has been a failure by successive governments to make sure that individuals arriving before 1973 have the documentation that they need, and we are putting it right as a matter of urgency. As my right honourable friend, the former Home Secretary, made a statement to the House last week in which he set out our approach to the Windrush generation, including the compensation scheme, and I have already referred to that this afternoon. I am, and I don't apologise for this, a pragmatic politician. I have always been focused on finding solutions, and that is exactly what we are trying to do now. When we saw Windrush cases emerging, we became focused on the operational side of helping those individuals. And as the former Home Secretary has said, we were too slow to identify the pattern and recognise it as part of a wider issue. For that, I am very sorry. And I want to make sure that we not only put this right, but also that we improve our mechanisms to make sure that if a similar systemic issue were to arise again, the Home Office would be able to identify it and resolve it much more clearly. The new contact centre will be at the heart of this, monitoring trends from incoming calls to understand where the problems are. And we will supplement this with insight and customer feedback to UK visas and immigration. I was asked earlier whether there would be a time limit on this, and can reassure members there will not be. Yeah, one last one.
I'll be very brief, and I thank the Minister for being so generous with her time. Could she clarify whether Home Office staff receive a bonus for the number of removals which they make?
So I'm absolutely unaware of any bonus scheme for removals. But what I want to focus on today is not removals, but actually making sure for the Windrush generation we get their British citizenship granted as swiftly as we can and at no cost to them. And the Honourable Lady has said silently so far, I am surprised. I'll let her.
Thank you, Minister, for giving way. I have been listening, so I'm trying to speak in the debate again on Wednesday and wanted to hear the contributions. This question, I think, is significant because I have also heard rumours that the head of immigration enforcement, that senior enforcement officials have had bonuses linked to enforcement performance, including meeting removals targets. I appreciate the Minister may not know the details right now, but I think if she could find some urgent clarity on that, that would be really important, because obviously in a system where there are no appeals, there are no independent appeals against a lot of these removals and this enforcement, to have a target-driven system that rewards people for the removals they do would obviously be very disturbing.
Right Honourable Lady has asked a specific question about bonuses, and I have said on the record I am not aware of any such system of bonuses. However, I will undertake to go away and find out prior to Wednesday's debate, when I look forward to being able to go over this issue in more detail, with more time, in the main chamber. I know, and everybody here knows, and I believe everybody in this House knows, that we regard the Windrush generation as being of us, part of us. I think the Honourable Lady opposite referred to them as being part of the furniture. We regard them as British, but we need to make sure they have the legal documentation confirming that. Nationality law is incredibly complicated, and I want to make sure that the legal status is cemented as soon as it possibly can be. We've made it clear that we wish the process to be simple and that nobody should have to undergo a life in the UK test or attend a citizenship ceremony unless they wish to. And some may, and of course we would want to make that available for those who do. And it's also the case, of course, that some may not wish to be British citizens at all. And we respect that position, but still need to confirm their status here, free of charge, as someone able to remain in the UK and access services. There will also be people in the Windrush generation who, having worked all their lives in Britain, and this was a point that was raised earlier, have retired to the country of their birth, but obviously retain strong ties here, which we should respect and we should nurture. And should they wish to come back, we will allow that to happen. I sympathise with anybody who has found the process difficult, and I would like to ensure, honourable members, that we are doing everything we can to make sure it is as smooth as possible. I am pleased that over 100 people have now been issued with the documentation they are seeking, but please be assured I am in no way complacent about that, and we will continue to improve the service that is provided. Finally,
there is another important point I say to the Honourable Lady. She will understand that there are some Caribbean countries that got their independence after 1973. Important countries, St Kitts, Antigua, St Lucia, and there are others. And there are a bunch of people very concerned about the 1973 cut-off. Can she say a little bit more about the situation for those people, some of whom may have come to this country as British subjects, because their independence did not come until later on in the 1970s or early 1980s. Antigua as late as 1982.
Minister.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for that question. It is, of course, something that my right honourable friend, the previous Home Secretary, addressed as how we solve the status and the situation of those who may have come here between 73 and 88. I am very aware of it, and what I wish to do going forward is make sure that we have a comprehensive package for those who I'm going to regard as the Windrush children, of whom there are very, very many. As I've said, I was in Sheffield and Croydon over the weekend, and listening to the calls that were being made and listening to the quality of the conversations that was going on. And they were conversations, they were in no way interrogative, and we have a process of a script that is evolving over time. At the end of every day, the script changes, and the lessons that have been learned from those conversations that have taken place during the day is used to make sure that things are better going forward. And this is an evolving, iterative process. I think I have addressed most of the questions that have been raised with me this afternoon. I think there are some important aspects that have been raised with me, which, if I have not addressed them, I will certainly come back to the House on Wednesday and make very clear. We are working very hard to resolve this. The new Home Secretary has made his position, his personal investment and commitment very clear, and we are working to make sure that going forward this cannot happen again. This year, as we have heard, is the 70th anniversary of the Empire Windrush arriving at Tilbury Docks, and that makes this all the more poignant and tragic. The government will be celebrating Windrush Day, and I will have the opportunity over the next few days to be speaking to the new Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government on how we can use that occasion to build trust with those we have let down. It is not lost on me that our new Home Secretary has come to the Home Office from the Department, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and it is, of course, he who introduced the paper on integration, which, of course, is so important going forward. He has a strong ally in the new Secretary of State in his old department, and that is, I am sure, a very strong link. In conclusion, I would like to reassure honourable and right honourable members this government is absolutely committed to righting the wrongs of the Windrush generation, to ensuring that those who have the right to be here in the United Kingdom are never treated in this way again, and to restore trust in the Home Office to deliver the outcome people deserve. I'm proud of the work that has been done over the past fortnight to set us on the right course, and I look forward to working with colleagues and officials over the coming months to accomplish those aims.
Steve Noble to wind up.
Thank you very much, Mr Robertson. And I just want to wind up by, first of all, thanking all honourable and right honourable members who have taken part into this debate. It's been, at times, passionate, it's been clear, and I think there have been some excellent contributions across the House, and many with very personal accounts which have been deeply moving. I also want to thank again Mr Vernon and all those who signed the petition that enabled this debate to take place today, and we are very grateful, and I've been delighted that we've been able to hold this debate today as part of the Petitions Committee. I think there's been great agreement across the House, agreement that we owe a huge debt of gratitude to the Windrush generation and all those who have come from Commonwealth countries and paid such an important role in our nation over the last decades and contributed so much. Agreement that wrong has been done to them. And I'm very grateful to the Minister for her very clear message on that matter, that there's no hiding from this, that something has dramatically gone wrong and needs to be put right. And also agreement that there are lessons that have to be learnt to ensure that where things have gone wrong, changes are made so that this can never be allowed to happen again. And I just want to say, in summing up, again, has been said by many honourable members in this debate, but to give that very clear message once again, that we are incredibly grateful to those who have come as part of that Windrush generation and others since who have contributed so much to our country, and that we are sorry that they have had to go through this experience, and that there is a very clear message from this House that we want them to stay, they belong here, they are part of our nation, and we want to do everything we possibly can to make sure they know that we are welcome, that they are welcome here, and we will do everything we can to resolve these issues so that they have the documentation they need to feel secure and that they belong here for the future. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 216539 relating to people who entered the UK as minors between 1948 and 1971. As many of that opinion say aye. As the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order, order.